Picture this: a single woman working quietly in the kitchens of New York's wealthiest families, preparing meals with hands that carried death itself. She looked perfectly healthy, felt perfectly fine. Yet everywhere she went, people began falling violently ill. Some would die, and the most terrifying part? She had no idea she was killing them. This is the story of Mary Mallon, better known as Typhoid Mary, the woman who became America's most feared disease carrier and forever changed how we understand the invisible spread of deadly illness. Between 1900 and 1915, this Irish immigrant cook infected dozens of people across New York, leaving a trail of fever, agony, and death that would make her name synonymous with contagion itself. But Mary's story isn't just about disease. It's about a woman caught between ignorance and science, between personal freedom and public safety, between being a victim and being a monster. It's about how one person's refusal to believe the truth about herself would lead to a lifetime of imprisonment and spark debates about medical ethics that continue to this day. To understand how Mary Mallon became Typhoid Mary, we need to step back into a world where germs were still a new and controversial idea, where hand-washing was considered unnecessary by many, and where diseases like typhoid fever killed 1 in every 10 people it touched. This was an America on the verge of major medical breakthroughs, but still trapped in the darkness of medical ignorance. In 1868, Mary Mallon was born in what is now Northern Ireland, into a world of poverty and limited opportunities. Like millions of other Irish immigrants, she came to America in the early 1880s seeking a better life. She was young, strong, and willing to work hard. What she found was employment as a cook for wealthy families in New York, a job that would put her in direct contact with the very people she would unknowingly terrorize for decades. Mary was good at her job. Families praised her cooking, and she commanded higher wages than many other domestic servants. She was known for her Irish stews, her fresh bread, and particularly for her homemade ice cream, which she prepared with her own hands, stirring and shaping it with the same unwashed fingers that carried millions of typhoid bacteria. But even as Mary was building her reputation as an excellent cook, something sinister was happening in the households where she worked. People were getting sick, not just mildly ill, but violently, terrifyingly sick with typhoid fever. Typhoid fever in 1900 was a nightmare disease. It began innocently enough, with what seemed like a common cold or flu. But within days, victims would develop raging fevers that could reach 104 degrees Fahrenheit. Their bodies would ache as if they'd been beaten. Severe headaches would leave them writhing in agony. Many would develop the telltale rose-colored rash across their chests that marked them as typhoid victims. As the disease progressed, victims would suffer violent diarrhea mixed with blood. Their abdomens would swell and distend painfully. In the worst cases, the bacteria would eat through the walls of their intestines, causing internal bleeding that could kill within hours. Even those who survived often suffered permanent damage to their hearts, brains, or other organs. The medical establishment of 1900 was only beginning to understand that diseases like typhoid were caused by bacteria, not by bad air or moral failings as had been believed for centuries. Germ theory was revolutionary, and many people, including Mary herself, simply didn't believe that invisible organisms could cause such devastating illness. What made typhoid particularly dangerous was how it spread. The bacteria lived in human waste and could contaminate water supplies, food, or anything touched by infected hands. A cook who didn't wash her hands after using the bathroom could transfer millions of bacteria to every meal she prepared. And in an era before antibiotics, once you contracted typhoid, there was little doctors could do except try to keep you comfortable while the disease ran its course. For Mary, working as a cook meant she had the perfect opportunity to spread typhoid without anyone suspecting her. She moved from family to family, staying just long enough to establish herself before mysterious outbreaks would begin. When people started getting sick, Mary would quietly leave, often changing her name slightly, and find work with a new family. Whether Mary understood what was happening is one of the great mysteries of her story. Did she know she was making people sick and simply not care? Was she in denial about her role in the outbreaks? Or was she genuinely ignorant of the connection between her presence and the diseases that followed her? The evidence suggests a complex mixture of all three. Mary lived in a world where many people, especially working-class immigrants, distrusted authority figures and medical experts. She had grown up believing that cleanliness was less important than hard work, that diseases came from God or bad luck, not from human hands. When officials would later tell her that she needed to wash her hands before cooking, she reportedly laughed and said she didn't see the point. But Mary's pattern of leaving jobs after outbreaks and changing her name suggests she may have suspected something, even if she couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it consciously. She was intelligent enough to see that sickness followed her, but perhaps not educated enough to understand why, or too frightened of the implications to face the truth. The families Mary worked for were among New York's elite. They lived in fine houses, employed multiple servants, and considered themselves far above the dirty, disease-ridden world of the city's poor immigrants. When typhoid struck their households, it was not just a medical crisis, but a social crisis. How could such a disease of poverty and filth invade their clean, respectable homes? Initially, doctors and health officials looked for the usual culprits: contaminated water, spoiled food, contact with sick outsiders. They tested wells, examined sewage systems, and quarantined obvious typhoid victims. But the outbreaks in wealthy households didn't fit the typical pattern. The source seemed to be internal, not external. It took a brilliant and persistent investigator to finally connect the dots. George Soper was a sanitary engineer working for the New York State Department of Health, a man trained in the new science of epidemiology. In 1906, he was called in to investigate a particularly puzzling outbreak that had struck a wealthy family renting a summer home in Oyster Bay, Long Island. 6 of the 11 people in the household had fallen ill with typhoid, including the family's daughter. The outbreak made no sense. The house was clean. The water was pure, and none of the family had traveled to areas where typhoid was common. Soper began what would become one of the first systematic epidemiological investigations in American history. Soper knew that typhoid had an incubation period of 1 to 3 weeks. This meant that whatever had caused the outbreak had been introduced to the household exactly 3 weeks before the first person became sick. He began methodically examining everything that had changed in the household during that critical period. The breakthrough came when Soper focused on the servants. 3 weeks before the outbreak began, the family had hired a new cook. Her name was Mary Mallon, and she had come with excellent references from previous employers. She was described as clean, efficient, and an excellent cook, particularly known for her desserts. But when Soper tried to interview Mary about the outbreak, he discovered she had already left her position. In fact, she had left very suddenly, just 3 weeks after the outbreak began, giving no notice and providing no forwarding address. This timing struck Soper as highly suspicious. He began investigating Mary's employment history, tracking her from job to job through employment agencies and references from previous employers. What he discovered horrified him. Everywhere Mary Mallon had worked, typhoid had followed. In 1900, she had worked for a family in Mamaroneck, New York. Within weeks of her arrival, the residents developed typhoid. In 1901, she moved to Manhattan to work for a lawyer's family. They came down with typhoid. In 1902, she took a position with a family in Dark Harbor, Maine. 9 of the 10 people in the household developed typhoid. The pattern continued year after year, job after job. Mary would arrive, people would get sick, and Mary would leave. Sometimes she left before the connection could be made. Sometimes she was dismissed when employers suspected the help might be involved. But always, she found new work, often under a slightly different name. Soper calculated that in just 7 jobs over 6 years, Mary had infected at least 22 people. One of them, a young girl named Margaret, had died. Mary wasn't just a carrier of typhoid. She was a one-woman epidemic. But proving Mary was the source and finding her again would prove to be two very different challenges. Soper faced a problem that would become familiar to epidemiologists. How do you prove that a healthy-looking person is the source of disease? And how do you convince that person to cooperate when they show no symptoms themselves? When Soper finally tracked Mary down in 1907, she was working for a prominent New York family on Park Avenue. She had taken the job under yet another slight variation of her name and had been there for several months. Incredibly, no one in the household had gotten sick yet, but Soper knew it was only a matter of time. Soper's first approach was diplomatic. He appeared at the family's kitchen door and asked to speak with Mary privately. He explained that he was investigating typhoid outbreaks and believed she might have information that could help. He suggested she might be an unwitting carrier of the disease and asked if she would provide samples for testing. Mary's reaction was immediate and violent. According to Soper's later account, she screamed that he was crazy, that she had never been sick a day in her life, and that she would not be insulted by some government man who didn't know what he was talking about. When Soper persisted, trying to explain the science behind asymptomatic carriers, Mary grabbed a large kitchen knife and chased him from the house. This confrontation revealed something crucial about Mary's mindset. She wasn't just refusing to cooperate. She was genuinely outraged by the suggestion that she could be making people sick. In her world, sick people looked sick. They had fevers, they stayed in bed, they showed obvious symptoms. The idea that she could be carrying and spreading disease while feeling perfectly healthy was not just medically incomprehensible to her. It was personally insulting. But Soper's investigation had convinced him beyond doubt that Mary was the source of the outbreaks. He had documented her presence at the scene of multiple typhoid cases, always arriving just before the illnesses began. He had shown that she had access to food preparation in every instance, and he had established her pattern of leaving jobs when people got sick. Faced with Mary's refusal to cooperate voluntarily, Soper made a decision that would forever change her life. He petitioned the New York City Health Department to have Mary forcibly detained for testing. This was an extraordinary step, one that had rarely been taken before. The city had the legal authority to quarantine people who posed a threat to public health, but that power had almost always been used against people who were obviously sick. The order to apprehend Mary was signed by Dr. Herman Biggs, the city's chief medical officer, a man who would become one of the pioneers of public health in America. Biggs understood that if Soper was right, Mary represented a new kind of threat, one that existing health laws and procedures weren't designed to handle. On March 19, 1907, a team of health department officials and police officers arrived at the Park Avenue mansion where Mary was working. They explained that she was wanted for questioning in connection with typhoid cases and asked her to come with them voluntarily for testing. Mary's response was to barricade herself in the house and refuse to come out. What followed was a bizarre 3-hour standoff, with health officials and police surrounding the mansion while Mary moved from room to room inside, shouting that she would not be taken by anyone. The authorities finally decided to search the house systematically. They found Mary hiding in a closet, clutching a rolling pin and vowing to fight anyone who touched her. It took several officers to subdue her and carry her to the ambulance that would take her to the hospital for testing. The scene was both tragic and absurd. Here was a middle-aged Irish woman, guilty of nothing more than trying to make a living as a cook, being dragged away by force because a government scientist believed she was spreading disease. To Mary, it must have seemed like the persecution of immigrants and the poor by the wealthy and powerful. To the health officials, it was a necessary step to protect public safety. At Willard Parker Hospital, doctors took samples of Mary's urine, feces, and blood. The tests took several days to complete, using the most advanced bacteriological techniques available in 1907. When the results came back, they confirmed Soper's theory in the most dramatic way possible. Mary's stool samples were teeming with typhoid bacteria. The concentration was so high that doctors estimated she was shedding millions of bacteria every time she used the bathroom. Her urine also contained the bacteria, though in smaller numbers. Most remarkably, her blood showed evidence that she had been infected with typhoid at some point in the past, but had never developed symptoms. Mary Mallon was what medical science would later term a chronic asymptomatic carrier. She had somehow been infected with typhoid, probably years earlier, but instead of getting sick, her body had reached a kind of truce with the bacteria. They lived in her gallbladder and intestines, reproducing constantly and being shed in her waste, but never making her feel ill. This was a completely new phenomenon in 1907. Doctors knew that some people could carry diseases for short periods after recovering from them, but no one had ever documented a case of someone carrying and spreading a deadly disease for years while remaining completely healthy themselves. The discovery made Mary Mallon a medical celebrity, but not in any way she would have wanted. Newspapers picked up the story, and she was soon being called Typhoid Mary in headlines across the country. The name captured the public imagination because it seemed to embody everyone's fears about invisible threats and the diseases that immigrants might bring to America. But for Mary herself, the test results were incomprehensible and unacceptable. She had never been sick. She felt fine. She looked healthy. How could doctors claim she was full of deadly bacteria? She became convinced that the tests were wrong, that the whole investigation was a conspiracy designed to persecute her because she was Irish and poor. Mary's refusal to accept the medical evidence put health officials in an impossible position. They had scientific proof that she was dangerous to public health, but she refused to take any precautions. She wouldn't stop working as a cook, wouldn't wash her hands more carefully, wouldn't even acknowledge that there might be a problem. The solution they chose would make Mary Mallon one of the most controversial figures in American medical history. On April 12, 1907, she was transferred to a small cottage on North Brother Island in the East River, where she would be held in quarantine indefinitely. North Brother Island was home to Riverside Hospital, a facility designed to isolate people with contagious diseases. Mary's cottage was comfortable but isolated, with a small garden and a view of the Manhattan skyline. She was provided with books, allowed to receive visitors, and given work helping in the hospital laboratory. But she was also a prisoner, held against her will with no clear idea of when or if she would ever be released. The quarantine of Typhoid Mary raised profound questions about individual rights versus public safety. Mary had committed no crime, yet she was being held indefinitely because of something she couldn't control and didn't believe was real. She had the right to work and support herself, yet her chosen profession made her a threat to everyone around her. These questions became even more complex as Mary's case attracted national attention. Lawyers offered to represent her pro bono, arguing that her detention was unconstitutional. Civil liberties advocates said she was being persecuted for her ethnicity and social class. Some newspapers portrayed her as a victim of government overreach and medical arrogance. But public health officials remained convinced they had no choice. Dr. Biggs and his colleagues had seen too many typhoid outbreaks, too many deaths, to risk allowing Mary to return to food preparation. They offered her alternatives. She could be released if she agreed to never work as a cook again and to check in regularly with health authorities. She could have her gallbladder surgically removed, which might eliminate the bacteria. She could even continue cooking if she agreed to take extraordinary precautions with hygiene. Mary rejected every proposal. She insisted she was not sick, could not make others sick, and had the right to work in whatever profession she chose. Her stubbornness was both admirable and infuriating. She was standing up for principles of personal freedom and dignity, but she was also potentially endangering innocent people. As the months of quarantine stretched into years, Mary's case became a symbol of the tensions between old and new ways of understanding disease. She represented millions of Americans who had grown up believing that illness was a matter of luck, divine will, or moral character, not invisible bacteria. The doctors and health officials represented the new scientific approach to disease, based on laboratory evidence and statistical analysis rather than visible symptoms. The scientific understanding of Mary's condition continued to evolve during her quarantine. Researchers studying her case discovered that typhoid bacteria could survive in the human gallbladder for decades, protected from the body's immune system and constantly reproducing. They learned that carriers like Mary were most dangerous when they prepared food, because the bacteria from their hands could multiply rapidly in warm, moist conditions. These discoveries helped explain why Mary's ice cream had been particularly dangerous. She made it by hand, mixing and molding it while the bacteria from her unwashed hands multiplied in the cream. Each serving she prepared was essentially a concentrated dose of typhoid, delivered directly to her employer's dining tables. But for Mary, scientific explanations meant nothing. She continued to insist that the whole thing was a mistake or a conspiracy. She wrote letters to newspapers protesting her treatment, filed legal challenges to her detention, and appealed to anyone who would listen that she was being held unjustly. In 1910, after 3 years of quarantine, Mary finally won a partial victory. A new health commissioner, Ernst Lederle, decided that her continued detention might indeed be unconstitutional. He offered her a deal. She could be released if she agreed never to work as a cook again and to report regularly to health authorities for monitoring. Mary agreed to the terms, though she made it clear she was accepting them under protest. On February 19, 1910, she walked out of her cottage on North Brother Island, a free woman for the first time in nearly 3 years. But freedom came with conditions that Mary found almost impossible to accept. She was forbidden from the work she knew best, and that paid her the highest wages. Instead, she was expected to take jobs as a laundress or cleaning woman, positions that paid much less and offered little job security. For several months, Mary tried to live within the restrictions. She found work at a commercial laundry, earning a fraction of what she had made as a cook. She reported to health authorities as required, submitting to regular testing that continued to show she was carrying typhoid bacteria. But as time went on, Mary became increasingly resentful of the limitations placed on her life. She was a skilled cook who could command good wages from wealthy families, yet she was forced to work in menial jobs that barely paid her rent. She was a free citizen, yet she had to report to government officials like a criminal on parole. The breaking point came when Mary lost her job at the laundry during an economic downturn in 1911. Faced with poverty and unable to find steady work in the jobs she was allowed to take, Mary made a decision that would seal her fate forever. She went back to cooking. Using a false name, Mary Mallon found employment as a cook at the Sloan Maternity Hospital in Manhattan. It was a job that put her in contact with some of the most vulnerable people in the city: new mothers and their babies, people whose immune systems were already stressed and who would be particularly susceptible to typhoid infection. For 5 years, Mary worked at the hospital under the name Mrs. Brown. She was careful, quiet, and competent. She avoided drawing attention to herself and stayed away from her old social circles. She may have hoped that she could simply disappear into anonymity and live out her life without further interference from health authorities. But typhoid bacteria don't disappear, and Mary's presence at the hospital soon had predictable consequences. In January 1915, doctors at Sloan Maternity Hospital began noticing an unusual number of typhoid cases among their patients and staff. Within weeks, 25 people had been infected, including several new mothers and 2 of whom died. Dr. George Soper, the same epidemiologist who had first tracked Mary down in 1907, was called in to investigate the outbreak. His methods had been refined over the years, and it didn't take him long to identify the source. When Soper discovered that the hospital's cook was a woman named Mrs. Brown, who matched Mary Mallon's description exactly, he knew he had found Typhoid Mary again. Fingerprint analysis confirmed her identity, and on March 27, 1915, Mary was arrested for the second time. This time, there would be no mercy, no second chances, no negotiations about terms of release. Mary had violated the agreement that had won her freedom, and in doing so, she had infected dozens more people and caused additional deaths. Public opinion, which had sometimes been sympathetic to her plight during her first quarantine, now turned decisively against her. Mary Mallon was returned to North Brother Island, to the same cottage where she had spent 3 years before. But this time, authorities made it clear that her quarantine would be permanent. She would never again be given the opportunity to infect innocent people. The second quarantine of Typhoid Mary was harsher than the first. She was older now, more bitter, and less able to maintain hope that her situation might change. The cottage that had once seemed like a temporary inconvenience now became her permanent prison. Mary spent her remaining years in isolation, cut off from the world she had known. She was allowed visitors occasionally, and she continued to write letters protesting her treatment, but public interest in her case had largely faded. She had become a medical footnote, a cautionary tale about the dangers of disease carriers. During her second quarantine, Mary's health began to decline. The woman who had once been famous for never being sick started showing signs of age and illness. She developed heart problems, suffered from arthritis, and gradually became more frail. On November 11, 1938, Mary Mallon died in her cottage on North Brother Island. She had spent a total of 26 years in quarantine, nearly a third of her entire life. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, though she had been weakened by multiple health problems. Mary's autopsy revealed typhoid bacteria still living in her gallbladder, nearly 30 years after her first quarantine began. Even in death, she remained a carrier of the disease that had defined her life. The story of Typhoid Mary didn't end with her death. Her case had established important precedents in public health law, epidemiology, and medical ethics that continue to influence policy today. She had been the first asymptomatic carrier ever identified, and her case had helped scientists understand how diseases could spread through seemingly healthy people. But Mary's legacy is complicated and controversial. She was undoubtedly responsible for infecting dozens of people and causing multiple deaths. Her refusal to accept medical evidence and take precautions was stubborn to the point of being criminal. Yet she was also a victim of circumstances beyond her control. A woman whose body harbored bacteria she couldn't see or feel, living in an era when the science of disease transmission was still new and poorly understood. Modern epidemiologists studying Mary's case have identified hundreds of other typhoid carriers from the same era, people who were found to be spreading disease without showing symptoms. Yet none of these other carriers were subjected to the lifetime quarantine that Mary endured. Most were simply monitored and required to avoid food handling jobs. This discrepancy raises uncomfortable questions about whether Mary was treated more harshly because of her gender, her ethnicity, her social class, or simply her refusal to cooperate with authorities. Would a wealthy American-born man in the same situation have faced lifetime imprisonment? The historical record suggests probably not. At the same time, Mary's case highlights the ongoing tension between individual rights and public health that remains relevant today. In an era of global pandemics, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and emerging infectious diseases, the questions raised by Typhoid Mary's story are as urgent as ever. How far should governments go to protect public health? When is it acceptable to restrict individual freedom for the greater good? How do we balance the rights of carriers with the rights of potential victims? What happens when people refuse to accept scientific evidence about their own role in spreading disease? Mary Mallon never accepted that she was Typhoid Mary. To the end of her life, she insisted that the doctors were wrong, that the tests were flawed, that she was the victim of a conspiracy. She died believing she had been unjustly imprisoned for crimes she never committed. But the evidence against her was overwhelming. By conservative estimates, Mary infected at least 51 people during her career as a cook. 3 of them died, including that first young girl whose death had helped launch George Soper's investigation. Others suffered lasting health problems from their infections. The tragedy of Mary Mallon is that she was both perpetrator and victim, both dangerous and pitiful. She was a woman caught between 2 worlds, the old world of superstition and ignorance about disease, and the new world of scientific medicine and public health. She couldn't or wouldn't make the transition, and the result was decades of suffering for herself and for the innocent people she infected. Today, we have antibiotics that can cure typhoid, vaccines that can prevent it, and public health systems that can track and contain outbreaks before they spread. We have a much better understanding of how diseases spread and how to protect ourselves and others. But we still have people who refuse vaccines, who ignore public health guidelines, who insist that their personal beliefs are more important than scientific evidence. In many ways, the ghost of Typhoid Mary still haunts our public health debates. Mary Mallon's story reminds us that disease doesn't respect boundaries of class, race, or nationality. It reminds us that the most dangerous carriers are often those who show no symptoms themselves. And it reminds us that the fight against infectious disease requires not just medical knowledge, but also trust, cooperation, and sometimes difficult choices about individual freedom versus collective safety. The woman who became known as Typhoid Mary was neither a monster nor a saint. She was a human being trapped in circumstances that neither she nor the medical authorities of her time fully understood how to handle. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how society treats those who are different, dangerous, or simply unlucky enough to become living symbols of our deepest fears. In the end, Mary Mallon spent more time in quarantine than many convicted murderers spend in prison. Yet she never intentionally killed anyone. She was guilty of ignorance, stubbornness, and a tragic inability to accept a reality that contradicted everything she believed about health and disease. But in an era when thousands of people died from typhoid every year, when a single contaminated meal could devastate an entire household, the authorities felt they had no choice but to remove her from society permanently. The cottage on North Brother Island where Mary spent her final years still stands today. Though the island is now abandoned and off-limits to the public, it serves as a haunting reminder of a woman who became one of the most feared people in America. Not because of anything she chose to do, but because of something she carried within her body that she never fully understood. Mary's medical records, preserved in the archives of the New York City Department of Health, continue to be studied by epidemiologists and public health experts. Her case helped establish the legal framework for quarantine powers that governments still use during disease outbreaks. The precedents set by her detention have been cited in court cases involving HIV-positive individuals, tuberculosis patients, and, more recently, people who refuse to comply with pandemic restrictions. But perhaps the most important lesson from Mary Mallon's story is not about law or medicine, but about human nature itself. She was a woman who refused to believe she could be harming others because she felt perfectly healthy herself. In our age of global travel, emerging diseases, and complex public health challenges, that kind of denial remains one of our greatest vulnerabilities. The bacteria that lived in Mary's gallbladder for decades were finally destroyed when her body was cremated in 1938. But the questions raised by her life and death continue to multiply and spread, infecting our debates about science, freedom, and responsibility in ways that may never be fully resolved. Mary Mallon, the woman who became Typhoid Mary, died as she had lived for the previous 3 decades, alone, defiant, and convinced to the end that she was the victim rather than the cause of one of the most fascinating and tragic episodes in American medical history. Her story stands as a permanent reminder that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are the ones we carry within ourselves, and the most difficult battles are the ones fought not against visible threats, but against the invisible forces that can make any of us, without warning or intention, a danger to everyone we touch. In a world where new diseases continue to emerge and spread, where people still struggle to understand and accept scientific evidence about invisible threats, the story of Typhoid Mary remains as relevant today as it was over a century ago. But Mary Mallon's story didn't end with her initial capture in quarantine in 1907. What happened next would prove even more shocking, revealing the true depths of the ethical and scientific challenges posed by this unprecedented case. After spending nearly 3 years confined to the cottage on North Brother Island, Mary found herself at the center of a legal battle that would test the very foundations of American civil liberties. Her case had attracted the attention of prominent lawyers who argued that indefinite quarantine without trial violated her constitutional rights. The public, initially supportive of her isolation, began to question whether the government's response was proportionate to the threat she posed. In 1910, after intense legal pressure and growing public sympathy for her plight, health officials agreed to release Mary under strict conditions. She would be required to report to health authorities regularly, submit to periodic medical examinations, and most critically, she was absolutely forbidden from working as a cook ever again. The agreement seemed straightforward enough. Mary would be free to live her life, earn a living in other professions, and the public would remain protected from the invisible threat she carried. For a brief period, it appeared the compromise might work. Mary took a position at a commercial laundry, earning significantly less than she had as a cook, but finally enjoying the freedom she had fought so desperately to regain. She reported dutifully to health officials, submitted to their examinations, and seemed to be adjusting to her new circumstances. Those monitoring her case began to hope that perhaps Mary had finally accepted the reality of her condition and would honor the terms of her release. But beneath this facade of compliance, Mary Mallon was planning her next move. The woman who had spent years denying the scientific evidence against her, who had chased investigators away with kitchen utensils, who had led authorities on a 3-hour chase through the streets of New York, was not about to accept a life of reduced circumstances and constant medical supervision. What she did next would transform her from a tragic figure caught between ignorance and science into something far more sinister. A woman whose deliberate choices would seal her fate as one of America's most notorious public health menaces. Within months of her release, Mary abandoned her laundry job and disappeared into the sprawling anonymity of New York City. She had learned from her previous experiences with authorities. This time, she would be more careful, more cunning in how she concealed her identity and activities. She began using false names, moving frequently between different neighborhoods, and most dangerously, she returned to the one profession explicitly forbidden to her: cooking. For 5 years, from 1910 to 1915, Mary Mallon operated as a culinary ghost, haunting the kitchens of New York's hospitals, hotels, and private homes. She had perfected the art of deception, presenting herself with forged references and carefully constructed false identities. To her employers, she appeared to be exactly what they needed: an experienced, skilled cook willing to work for reasonable wages. They had no idea they were hiring America's most dangerous woman. The science behind Mary's condition was becoming clearer during these years, even as she continued to evade detection. Researchers had determined that the typhoid bacteria had taken up residence in her gallbladder, creating a reservoir of infection that would contaminate everything she touched. Her poor hygiene habits, particularly her refusal to wash her hands after using the bathroom, meant that every meal she prepared became a potential vector for disease transmission. What made Mary's case particularly insidious was the delayed nature of typhoid symptoms. Unlike diseases that strike immediately, typhoid could take weeks to manifest, allowing Mary to move on to new employment before the consequences of her presence became apparent. By the time people started falling ill, she was already established elsewhere, ready to repeat the cycle with new victims. The trail of suffering she left during these 5 years of freedom was methodically documented by health investigators who would later piece together her movements. At a maternity hospital on the Upper East Side, she infected 4 new mothers and a nurse. At a private home in Westchester, an entire family fell ill, with the youngest child requiring hospitalization. At a hotel kitchen in Manhattan, she infected 6 fellow employees before disappearing once again. Each outbreak followed the same pattern. Healthy people would suddenly develop the telltale high fever, the devastating headaches, the distinctive rose-colored rash that marked typhoid's progression. Some recovered after weeks of agony. Others died. All were victims of a woman who had been given a chance at freedom and had chosen to use it as an opportunity to continue spreading death. The most horrific incident of Mary's underground career occurred at the Sloan Maternity Hospital, where she had secured a position as a cook under the name Mrs. Brown. Maternity hospitals were particularly vulnerable to typhoid outbreaks because new mothers, already weakened by childbirth, had compromised immune systems that made them easy targets for the disease. Within weeks of Mary's arrival at Sloan, the hospital was in crisis. 25 people had contracted typhoid, including doctors, nurses, and new mothers. 2 people died, including a young mother who had given birth just days before falling ill. The hospital was forced to close temporarily, turning away expectant mothers who desperately needed medical care. The outbreak at Sloan was so severe and so concentrated that it immediately caught the attention of health authorities. The pattern was unmistakably familiar to those who had investigated Mary's previous cases. When they began looking into the hospital's recent staff changes, they discovered that a cook named Mrs. Brown had been hired just weeks before the outbreak began. The investigation that followed was swift and decisive. Photographs of Mary were shown to hospital staff, confirming that Mrs. Brown was indeed Mary Mallon. When authorities arrived to arrest her, they found her in the hospital kitchen, calmly preparing meals that could have infected dozens more people. This time, there would be no legal battles, no public sympathy, no possibility of release. Mary had been given her chance at freedom and had used it to deliberately endanger innocent lives. The woman who had once been seen as a victim of circumstances beyond her control was now revealed to be something far more disturbing. A knowing agent of disease who had chosen to continue her deadly work even after being explicitly warned of the consequences. The second arrest of Mary Mallon in 1915 marked a turning point not just in her personal story, but in the broader understanding of public health ethics and individual responsibility. When she was first quarantined in 1907, she could claim ignorance, could argue that the science was uncertain, could position herself as a victim of prejudice and government overreach. But by 1915, there could be no such claims. Mary had been thoroughly educated about her condition. She had been shown the scientific evidence. She had been given explicit instructions about the danger she posed to others. Her return to cooking, her use of false names, her pattern of moving from job to job, leaving illness in her wake, all pointed to a level of conscious choice that transformed her from tragic figure to deliberate menace. The public reaction to her second arrest was swift and unforgiving. Newspapers that had once expressed sympathy for her plight now condemned her as a selfish monster who valued her own convenience over the lives of innocent people. Editorial writers called her a walking plague, a human weapon of mass destruction, a woman so morally corrupt that she was willing to spread death for the sake of earning a few dollars. Medical professionals, too, hardened their attitudes toward Mary. During her first quarantine, some had argued for more humane treatment, suggesting that she was as much a victim of the disease as those she infected. But her deliberate return to cooking after being explicitly warned changed that calculus entirely. She had proven that she could not be trusted, that she would continue to pose a threat to public safety as long as she remained free. The legal framework surrounding her case also evolved. While her first quarantine had raised difficult questions about civil liberties and the limits of government power, her second quarantine was seen as an open and shut case of public safety. A person who knowingly and deliberately spread a deadly disease had forfeited their right to freedom. The precedent established by Mary's case would influence public health law for generations to come. When Mary was returned to North Brother Island in 1915, it was with the explicit understanding that she would never again be released. The cottage that had been her temporary prison now became her permanent home, a place where she would spend the remaining 23 years of her life in isolation, paying the ultimate price for her choices. The conditions of her permanent quarantine were harsh by any standard. She was allowed minimal contact with the outside world, restricted to a small cottage and its immediate surroundings. Her only regular human contact came from the medical staff who continued to study her case, taking periodic samples and monitoring her condition. She was given basic necessities but few comforts, existing in a state of suspended animation between freedom and imprisonment. Yet even in permanent quarantine, Mary continued to maintain her innocence. She wrote letters to newspapers, to government officials, to anyone who would listen, protesting her treatment and insisting that she had never harmed anyone. She claimed that the deaths attributed to her were coincidental, that the science linking her to typhoid outbreaks was flawed, that she was being persecuted because of her Irish heritage and working-class status. These protests fell on deaf ears. By 1915, the scientific evidence against Mary was overwhelming, and her deliberate violation of her release conditions had eliminated any remaining sympathy for her situation. She had become, in the public mind, not a victim, but a villain, a woman whose selfishness and stubborn refusal to accept reality had cost innocent lives. By early 1915, after 7 years of forced isolation on North Brother Island, Mary Mallon had seemingly learned to accept her circumstances. She tended a small garden outside her cottage, assisted in the hospital laboratory by washing bottles and equipment, and had even developed what appeared to be cordial relationships with some of the medical staff. The woman who had once chased health officials with a meat cleaver now seemed resigned to her fate as the world's most notorious disease carrier. This apparent transformation would prove to be nothing more than an elaborate deception. What health officials didn't realize was that Mary had been carefully studying the routines of the guards, the schedules of the ferry boats that connected North Brother Island to the mainland, and the various supply deliveries that came and went from the hospital complex. Her compliant behavior was merely a facade, concealing a burning desire for freedom and an absolute refusal to accept that she posed any danger to public health. The opportunity Mary had been waiting for came during a particularly harsh winter storm in February 1915. A supply boat carrying medical equipment and food had been delayed by the weather, and several staff members were homesick with seasonal illnesses. Security was unusually lax, and Mary saw her chance. Using a small rowboat that had been carelessly left unsecured near the hospital dock, she attempted to escape across the treacherous waters of the East River. The boat was discovered missing the next morning, along with Mary herself. For 3 terrifying days, health officials feared that Typhoid Mary had successfully escaped back into the general population of New York City. The manhunt that followed was unprecedented in the annals of public health enforcement. Police officers, health inspectors, and even federal agents scoured the city's restaurants, boarding houses, and employment agencies. Newspaper headlines screamed warnings about the dangerous woman who might once again be spreading deadly disease through the food she prepared. Mary was finally found hiding in the basement of a tenement building on the Lower East Side, sick with pneumonia and barely conscious from exposure to the freezing February weather. She had made it less than halfway across the river before her boat had capsized, forcing her to swim to shore in water so cold it nearly killed her. When she was returned to North Brother Island, any pretense of humane treatment was abandoned. Mary was confined to a smaller, more secure cottage with barred windows and a reinforced door. Her movements were constantly monitored, and she was no longer permitted to work in the laboratory or tend her garden. The woman who had once been treated as a medical curiosity was now regarded as a dangerous criminal. But Mary's attempted escape had accomplished something far more significant than her brief taste of freedom. It had demonstrated to health officials that she would never willingly comply with measures designed to protect public health, and it had revealed the depth of her delusion about her own condition. During her interrogation following the escape attempt, Mary made statements that chilled even the hardened doctors who had been studying her case for years. She insisted that the typhoid outbreaks that had followed her throughout her career were nothing more than coincidence, that the scientific evidence linking her to dozens of infections was fabricated, and that she was being persecuted because she was an Irish immigrant and a woman. Most disturbing of all, she expressed her intention to return to cooking the moment she was free, declaring that it was her right to earn a living in the profession she knew best, regardless of what doctors claimed about her condition. Dr. George Soper, the epidemiologist who had first identified Mary as a carrier, documented these statements in a report that would fundamentally change how public health authorities approached similar cases in the future. Mary's complete rejection of scientific evidence, combined with her demonstrated willingness to risk other people's lives, established a new category in medical jurisprudence: the willfully non-compliant carrier. This wasn't simply a case of an unfortunate woman who happened to carry dangerous bacteria. This was a case of someone who understood the allegations against her, had access to scientific evidence of her condition, and chose to reject that evidence in favor of her own beliefs and desires. The legal and ethical implications were staggering. For the first time in American history, Health officials were dealing with someone who posed a public health threat not through ignorance or accident, but through deliberate choice. Mary's case files from this period reveal a woman whose mental state was deteriorating under the stress of prolonged isolation. She began writing lengthy letters to newspapers, lawyers, and government officials, filled with increasingly paranoid theories about the conspiracy she believed was being waged against her. She claimed that wealthy families were using her as a scapegoat to avoid taking responsibility for their own poor sanitation practices. She suggested that doctors were deliberately infecting people with typhoid and then blaming her to advance their careers. In one particularly disturbing letter to the New York Health Commissioner, Mary wrote, "I am being held prisoner because I am Irish and poor, and because these rich doctors need someone to blame for their failures. I have never been sick a day in my life, and I know my own body better than any man with a diploma on his wall." The letter was never published, but it was preserved in Mary's medical file as evidence of her continued refusal to acknowledge the danger she posed. Meanwhile, the scientific understanding of typhoid carriers was advancing rapidly. Other asymptomatic carriers had been identified, and researchers were beginning to understand the biological mechanisms that allowed some people to harbor deadly bacteria without becoming ill themselves. The discovery of Mary's condition had opened an entirely new field of epidemiological research. But while science was progressing, Mary remained frozen in denial. She refused to participate in studies that might have helped researchers develop better treatments for typhoid carriers. She rejected surgical procedures that might have eliminated the bacteria from her system. She even refused to acknowledge the test results that clearly showed massive concentrations of Salmonella bacteria in her stool and urine samples. This obstinacy extended to every aspect of her medical care. When doctors suggested dietary changes that might reduce the bacterial load she carried, Mary dismissed their recommendations as attempts to poison her. When they offered to teach her proper food handling techniques that could minimize the risk of transmission, she insisted that her cooking methods were perfectly sanitary and that any suggestion otherwise was an insult to her professional competence. The tragic irony of Mary's situation was that by 1915, medical science had advanced to the point where her condition might have been manageable. Surgical removal of her gallbladder, where the typhoid bacteria had established their primary colony, could potentially have eliminated her carrier status entirely. Strict adherence to sanitation protocols could have allowed her to work in food service with minimal risk to others. But Mary's absolute refusal to cooperate with medical authorities made these solutions impossible. The broader implications of Mary's case were becoming clear to public health officials across the country. Here was a situation where individual rights and freedoms came into direct conflict with collective public safety. Mary genuinely believed she was innocent of any wrongdoing, yet the scientific evidence of her danger to others was overwhelming and undeniable. The question that haunted health officials was whether society had the right to indefinitely confine someone who posed a public health threat, but refused to take voluntary measures to minimize that threat. Mary's case was establishing precedents that would influence public health law for generations to come. As 1915 progressed and Mary remained in her secured cottage on North Brother Island, a new reality was setting in for everyone involved in her case. This was no longer a temporary quarantine that would end when Mary learned to cooperate or when medical science found a cure for her condition. This had become a permanent arrangement that would likely last for the rest of Mary's life. The woman who had once been New York's most sought-after cook, whose meals had been served in some of the city's finest homes, was now spending her days in a small room with barred windows, forbidden from practicing the only profession she had ever known, surrounded by doctors and guards who viewed her as a dangerous specimen rather than a human being. But Mary's story was far from over. The next phase of her life would reveal new depths to her tragedy, as the isolation and confinement began to take an even greater toll on her mental and physical health, and as the world around her changed in ways that would make her case seem both more relevant and more troubling than ever before. By 1915, Mary Mallon had become the most infamous woman in America. Her defiance of public health orders and her deliberate return to cooking under false identities had transformed her from a medical curiosity into a symbol of dangerous obstinacy. The outbreak at Sloan Maternity Hospital would mark the beginning of the final chapter in her story, one that would raise profound questions about the balance between individual liberty and public safety. The Sloan Maternity Hospital outbreak was particularly devastating because of the vulnerable population it affected. 25 cases of typhoid fever erupted among patients, staff, and newborns. 2 people died, including a doctor who had been treating the infected patients. When investigators traced the source of the outbreak, they discovered that the hospital's cook, who had been working under the name Mrs. Brown, was none other than Mary Mallon. The authorities were furious. They had shown mercy in 1910, releasing Mary with the simple condition that she never work as a cook again. She had violated that agreement almost immediately, and her deception had continued for 5 years. Dr. Herman Biggs, who had overseen her first release, felt personally betrayed by her actions. He had believed that education and understanding would be sufficient to prevent future outbreaks, but Mary's behavior had proven him wrong. This time, there would be no negotiations, no conditions for release, and no second chances. On March 27, 1915, Mary Mallon was arrested for the final time. She was transported back to North Brother Island, where she would spend the remaining 23 years of her life in permanent quarantine. The cottage that had once been a temporary measure became her prison for life. The decision to quarantine Mary permanently was not made lightly. By 1915, public health officials had identified hundreds of other healthy typhoid carriers in New York City, alone. The vast majority of these carriers were men, and they worked in various professions that brought them into contact with the public. Yet none of them faced the same level of scrutiny or punishment that Mary received. This discrepancy would later become a source of significant controversy and debate. Several factors contributed to Mary's unique treatment. First, her profession as a cook made her particularly dangerous. Cooking involved handling food that would be consumed by others, creating multiple opportunities for transmission. The warm, moist environment of many foods also provided ideal conditions for typhoid bacteria to multiply. Second, Mary's repeated violations of public health orders demonstrated that she could not be trusted to follow voluntary guidelines. Other carriers who cooperated with authorities and changed their occupations were allowed to remain free. Perhaps most importantly, Mary's steadfast refusal to accept the scientific evidence against her made her a unique case. Even when presented with irrefutable proof that she carried typhoid bacteria, she continued to deny any connection between her presence and the outbreaks that followed her. This denial was not simply a matter of ignorance or lack of education. Mary was intelligent and had been thoroughly educated about germ theory and disease transmission. Her refusal to accept the evidence appeared to be willful and deliberate. The public's perception of Mary had also evolved significantly since her first quarantine. Initially, some had viewed her as a victim of government overreach, an innocent woman caught up in circumstances beyond her control. But her deliberate violation of the conditions of her release and her continued spread of disease had eroded much of this sympathy. Newspapers now portrayed her as a selfish and dangerous individual who put her own desires above the lives of innocent people. The scientific understanding of Mary's condition had also advanced considerably by 1915. Researchers had determined that the typhoid bacteria had taken up residence in her gallbladder, where they multiplied and were continuously shed in her feces. This explained why she remained infectious despite appearing healthy. The bacteria had essentially turned her gallbladder into a reservoir for the disease, making her a permanent threat to public health. Dr. George Soper, who had first identified Mary as a carrier, proposed a solution that he believed would benefit everyone involved. He suggested that Mary undergo surgery to remove her gallbladder, which would eliminate the source of the bacteria and potentially cure her condition. This would allow her to return to society and resume her career as a cook, while also protecting the public from further outbreaks. The gallbladder removal surgery was not without risks in 1915, but it was a procedure that had been performed successfully on other typhoid carriers. Several individuals had undergone the operation and had been declared free of the bacteria afterward. However, Mary adamantly refused to consider the surgery. She maintained that she was not sick and did not carry any disease, so there was no need for medical intervention. Mary's refusal to undergo the surgery became another source of frustration for public health officials. They argued that she was being offered a clear path to freedom and chose to reject it. From their perspective, Mary was choosing to remain in quarantine rather than accept a medical solution to her condition. This strengthened their belief that she was fundamentally unreasonable and could not be trusted to make decisions that would protect public health. However, Mary's perspective was quite different. She viewed the proposed surgery as an unnecessary and dangerous procedure being forced upon her based on false premises. She had never been sick with typhoid fever, never experienced its symptoms, and felt perfectly healthy. From her point of view, the doctors were asking her to undergo a risky operation to treat a condition she did not have. Her refusal was not necessarily irrational, given her fundamental disagreement with the diagnosis. The quarantine facility on North Brother Island was expanded and modified to accommodate Mary's permanent residency. The cottage where she lived was comfortable but isolated, with limited opportunities for social interaction. She was allowed to receive visitors occasionally, but these visits were strictly supervised and limited in duration. Mary was also permitted to correspond with friends and family members, though her letters were monitored by health officials. Despite the restrictions, Mary attempted to make the best of her situation. She took on various responsibilities around the hospital, including helping with laboratory work and assisting with administrative tasks. She became particularly skilled at preparing specimens for analysis and was considered a valuable member of the hospital staff. However, she was never allowed to work in the kitchen or handle food that would be consumed by others. Mary also pursued legal challenges to her quarantine, filing multiple lawsuits arguing that her detention was unconstitutional and violated her civil rights. She contended that she was being punished for a crime she had not committed, and that the state had no right to imprison her indefinitely without due process. Her legal battles continued for years, but courts consistently ruled that the state's power to protect public health superseded her individual rights. The legal precedents established by Mary's case would have lasting implications for public health policy in the United States. Courts affirmed that the government had broad authority to quarantine individuals who posed a threat to public health, even if those individuals had not committed any crimes. This principle would later be applied to other infectious diseases and would become a cornerstone of modern epidemic control measures. As the years passed, Mary's story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ignoring public health measures. Medical schools used her case to teach students about disease transmission and the importance of cooperation between patients and healthcare providers. Public health officials pointed to her example when arguing for stronger enforcement mechanisms and more severe penalties for violations of quarantine orders. Yet Mary's case also raised troubling questions about fairness and equal treatment under the law. The fact that she was the only typhoid carrier subjected to permanent quarantine, despite the identification of hundreds of others, suggested that factors beyond public health considerations may have influenced her treatment. Some observers noted that Mary was an Irish immigrant and a woman, both groups that faced significant discrimination in early 20th century America. The intersection of gender, class, and ethnicity in Mary's case cannot be ignored. As a domestic servant, she occupied one of the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. Her Irish heritage made her a target of prejudice and suspicion, as Irish immigrants were often stereotyped as dirty, disease-carrying, and morally deficient. Her gender also played a role, as women were expected to be nurturing and protective, particularly in roles involving food preparation and childcare. Mary's apparent indifference to the harm she was causing violated these expectations and made her seem particularly threatening. The scientific advances that occurred during Mary's quarantine gradually vindicated the authorities' actions while also providing new insights into her condition. Researchers developed better methods for detecting typhoid bacteria and gained a deeper understanding of how the disease was transmitted. They also identified the specific characteristics that made certain individuals more likely to become chronic carriers of the bacteria. By the 1920s, improved sanitation and the development of more effective vaccines had significantly reduced the incidence of typhoid fever in the United States. The disease that had once terrified urban populations was becoming increasingly rare, relegated primarily to areas with poor sanitation or inadequate public health infrastructure. Mary's case, which had once been front-page news, gradually faded from public attention as more pressing health concerns emerged. However, Mary herself remained on North Brother Island, largely forgotten by the public that had once viewed her as a major threat. She continued to maintain her innocence and refused to accept any responsibility for the outbreaks that had followed her career. Her denial was so complete and consistent that some observers wondered whether she had developed a form of psychological defense mechanism that prevented her from acknowledging the reality of her situation. Mary's daily life in quarantine was marked by routine and isolation. She woke each morning in her cottage, took her meals alone, and spent her days performing assigned tasks around the hospital. She read voraciously, particularly enjoying newspapers and magazines that kept her connected to the outside world. She also developed a love of gardening and was allowed to maintain a small plot of vegetables and flowers near her cottage. Despite the restrictions, Mary formed relationships with some of the hospital staff and long-term patients. She was known for her sharp wit and strong opinions, and those who worked with her described her as intelligent and articulate. However, she could also be difficult and demanding, particularly when she felt that her rights were being violated or when discussions turned to her medical condition. The question of Mary's mental state during her quarantine years remains a subject of debate. Some observers suggested that her continued denial indicated a form of mental illness or psychological disorder. Others argued that her refusal to accept the evidence against her was a rational response to what she perceived as unjust treatment. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes, with Mary's psychological state influenced by both her personality and the extraordinary circumstances of her situation. As Mary aged, her health began to decline, though she never showed symptoms of typhoid fever. She developed arthritis, which made her work around the hospital more difficult, and she suffered from periods of depression and anxiety. She also became increasingly bitter about her treatment, particularly as she learned that other typhoid carriers were living freely in society while she remained confined. The ethical questions raised by Mary's case continued to evolve as medical and legal thinking advanced. The emergence of new infectious diseases and the development of more sophisticated understanding of disease transmission forced policymakers to grapple with the same fundamental questions that had arisen during Mary's quarantine. How should society balance individual rights against collective safety? What level of risk justifies restricting someone's freedom? These questions would become even more pressing as new diseases emerged and global travel increased the potential for rapid disease transmission. Mary Mallon's story represents a complex intersection of science, law, ethics, and human nature. Her case established important precedents for public health policy, while also highlighting the potential for abuse of government power. Her refusal to accept scientific evidence and her deliberate violation of public health measures made her a unique figure in medical history, one whose legacy continues to influence discussions about disease control and individual responsibility. The woman who had once been Mary Mallon, the Irish immigrant seeking a better life in America, had become Typhoid Mary, a symbol of the dangers posed by those who refused to accept scientific evidence and public health measures. Mary Mallon had been cornered before. She had been tested, quarantined, and released under strict conditions. She had been warned never to cook again. But here she was in 1915, standing in the kitchen of Sloan Maternity Hospital, her hands covered in flour, surrounded by the evidence of her defiance. 25 new cases of typhoid had erupted through the hospital like wildfire. Pregnant women, newborn babies, doctors, nurses, all falling victim to the same invisible enemy that had followed Mary wherever she went. This time, there would be no mercy. This time, the authorities had reached their breaking point. The woman who would become known as the most dangerous person in America was about to face the consequences of a decision that would define not just her fate, but the very principles of public health in the modern world. Mary Mallon had made her choice. Now society would make theirs. When George Soper first identified Mary as the source of typhoid outbreaks in 1906, he had hoped that education and cooperation would solve the problem. He believed that once Mary understood she was an asymptomatic carrier, she would willingly submit to treatment or at least agree to stop working as a cook. He was wrong on both counts. Mary's response to the scientific evidence was not acceptance but absolute denial. She refused to believe that someone who felt perfectly healthy could be spreading deadly disease. More importantly, she refused to give up the only profession that provided her with decent wages and some measure of independence. The concept of asymptomatic carriers was revolutionary in 1906. Medical science was just beginning to understand that healthy-looking individuals could harbor dangerous pathogens without showing any symptoms themselves. Mary became the first documented case of what we now call a superspreader, someone whose particular biological makeup allows them to transmit disease far more effectively than the average infected person. But in Mary's mind, the entire theory was nothing more than an elaborate conspiracy designed to destroy her livelihood and her freedom. Her initial 3-year quarantine from 1907 to 1910 had been intended as both punishment and protection. Health officials hoped that isolation would either cure her of the bacteria or at least convince her to cooperate with medical authorities. Neither happened. During her confinement on North Brother Island, Mary maintained her innocence and grew increasingly bitter toward the doctors and officials who had imprisoned her. She saw herself as a victim of discrimination, a poor Irish immigrant being scapegoated for diseases that she believed had nothing to do with her. The conditions of her release in 1910 were clear and non-negotiable. Mary was forbidden from working as a cook ever again. She was required to report regularly to health authorities. She was instructed to maintain strict hygiene practices, particularly regarding hand washing. Most importantly, she was supposed to notify officials immediately if she changed jobs or residences. These conditions represented a compromise between public safety and individual liberty, an attempt to allow Mary some freedom while protecting the public from further outbreaks. For a brief period, it seemed like the compromise might work. Mary found employment at a commercial laundry, work that was physically demanding but kept her away from food preparation. The pay was significantly lower than what she had earned as a cook, barely enough to survive in New York City. The work was tedious and offered none of the satisfaction or status that came with being a skilled cook in wealthy households. Mary had spent years perfecting her culinary abilities, building a reputation among New York's elite families as someone who could prepare elaborate meals for dinner parties and social gatherings. Working in a laundry felt like a crushing demotion. The exact timeline of Mary's return to cooking remains unclear, but by 1912, she had disappeared from her laundry job and from the oversight of health authorities. What followed was a 3-year game of cat and mouse as Mary adopted new identities and found work in various kitchens throughout New York City. She used different names, provided false references, and carefully avoided the neighborhoods where she was known. Her skills as a cook made her valuable to employers, and the constant turnover of domestic staff in wealthy households meant that background checks were often perfunctory at best. During this period, Mary's behavior suggests a complex psychology that went beyond simple defiance. She could have found other work that didn't involve food preparation. She could have left New York City entirely and started fresh in a place where her notoriety wouldn't follow her. Instead, she repeatedly chose to return to the profession that authorities had explicitly forbidden, often using variations of her real name that seem almost designed to tempt fate. Mary Mullane, Mary Miller, Mary Morrison. It was as if she couldn't completely abandon her identity even while trying to hide it. The decision to work at Sloan Maternity Hospital in 1915 represented the most reckless choice of Mary's career. Hospitals were under increased scrutiny for infectious diseases. Maternity wards were considered especially vulnerable populations. The risk of detection was enormous, and the potential consequences of an outbreak among pregnant women and newborns would be catastrophic. Yet Mary took the position, possibly under the name Mary Brown, and began preparing meals for some of the most medically fragile people in the city. The outbreak that followed was swift and devastating. Within weeks of Mary's employment, cases of typhoid began appearing throughout the hospital. Unlike previous outbreaks that had affected individual families, this one threatened an entire medical institution. Pregnant women developed high fevers and severe abdominal pain. Several went into premature labor. Newborn babies, with their undeveloped immune systems, were particularly vulnerable to the infection. Hospital staff, already overworked and stressed, began falling ill in alarming numbers. Dr. Edward Cragen, the hospital's chief obstetrician, immediately suspected a common source of infection. His investigation followed the same pattern that George Soper had established nearly a decade earlier. He examined the water supply, investigated the food sources, and scrutinized the staff. When he learned that a new cook had been hired just weeks before the outbreak began, he contacted the city health department. The description they provided of the woman they were seeking matched perfectly with the hospital's newest employee. The arrest of Mary Mallon at Sloan Maternity Hospital was far different from her first capture in 1907. There were no dramatic chase scenes or struggles with meat cleavers. Mary seemed to understand that her years of freedom were over. When confronted by health officials, she offered little resistance. Perhaps she was exhausted by the constant vigilance required to maintain her false identities. Perhaps she recognized that the evidence against her had become overwhelming. Or perhaps she simply accepted that her defiance had finally caught up with her. The public reaction to Mary's recapture was immediate and harsh. Newspapers that had once portrayed her as a victim of government overreach now condemned her as a selfish criminal who had deliberately endangered innocent lives. The fact that she had violated the terms of her release and returned to the very profession she had been forbidden to practice eliminated much of the sympathy she had previously enjoyed. Editorial writers described her as a walking weapon, a person who had chosen personal convenience over public safety. The medical community's response was more complex. Many doctors and researchers were fascinated by Mary's case from a scientific perspective. She remained the most well-documented example of an asymptomatic typhoid carrier, and her continued ability to spread the disease while appearing perfectly healthy challenged conventional understanding of infectious disease transmission. However, her refusal to cooperate with medical authorities and her deliberate violation of quarantine conditions had complicated efforts to study her condition and develop protocols for managing similar cases. Public health officials faced a dilemma that had no clear precedent in American law or medical practice. Mary had demonstrated that she could not be trusted to follow restrictions voluntarily. She had shown no regard for the safety of others and no willingness to make personal sacrifices for the greater good. Traditional quarantine procedures were designed for people who were visibly ill and motivated to recover. Mary presented a new category of public health threat, someone who was permanently infectious but permanently uncooperative. The decision to impose lifetime quarantine on Mary Mallon was unprecedented in American public health history. Never before had authorities confined someone indefinitely based solely on their potential to spread disease. The legal justification was tenuous, relying on broad interpretations of municipal authority to protect public welfare. The ethical implications were staggering, essentially sentencing someone to prison for a biological condition they claimed not to understand and could not control. Mary's reaction to her life sentence was a mixture of resignation and continued defiance. She maintained her innocence regarding the typhoid outbreaks, but seemed to accept that her fate was sealed. Her living conditions on North Brother Island during this second quarantine were marginally better than during her first confinement. She was given more freedom to move around the island, allowed to assist with laboratory work, and permitted occasional visitors. However, the psychological impact of knowing she would never be free again took a visible toll on her mental and physical health. The scientific study of Mary's condition continued throughout her second quarantine, but with diminishing returns. Doctors had confirmed that the Salmonella bacteria resided in her gallbladder, creating a permanent reservoir of infection that she spread through poor hygiene practices. They had documented her ability to infect others through food preparation and had traced the specific patterns of transmission in multiple outbreaks. What they could not determine was why Mary's immune system failed to eliminate the bacteria, or why she remained asymptomatic while others became severely ill. The proposed solution was surgical removal of Mary's gallbladder, a procedure that doctors believed would eliminate her ability to carry and spread the typhoid bacteria. The operation was risky by 1915 standards, but not prohibitively so. Many patients had undergone successful gallbladder removal for other conditions. For Mary, the surgery represented a potential path to freedom, a way to address the medical condition that had made her a public health threat. Her refusal to consent to the procedure baffled medical authorities and frustrated public health officials who saw it as a reasonable solution to an impossible problem. Mary's rejection of surgery reflected her continued denial of her role in spreading typhoid, but it also represented something deeper. She had spent nearly a decade being treated as a medical specimen rather than a human being. Doctors had taken hundreds of biological samples from her body without her consent. She had been exhibited to medical students and journalists like a curiosity in a freak show. The proposed surgery, even if medically justified, represented another violation of her bodily autonomy by authorities she neither trusted nor respected. The broader implications of Mary's case extended far beyond one woman's personal tragedy. Her story raised fundamental questions about the balance between individual rights and collective safety that remain relevant today. How much personal freedom can society demand individuals sacrifice for public health? What level of cooperation can authorities reasonably expect from people who face permanent restrictions on their liberty? When do public health measures cross the line from protection to persecution? Mary's case also exposed uncomfortable truths about discrimination and inequality in early 20th century America. She was poor, Irish, female, and unmarried, characteristics that made her particularly vulnerable to harsh treatment by authorities. Other asymptomatic typhoid carriers were identified during Mary's lifetime, but none faced the same level of scrutiny or punishment. Most were men, most had more resources, and most were more willing to cooperate with health authorities. The question of whether Mary's treatment was influenced by her social status rather than just her medical condition became a source of ongoing controversy. The precedent established by Mary's lifetime quarantine would influence public health policy for generations. Her case became a standard reference point in discussions of infectious disease control, cited both as an example of necessary decisive action and as a cautionary tale about government overreach. Law schools taught her story as an illustration of the tensions between individual liberty and state power. Medical schools used her case to discuss the ethical implications of treating non-cooperative patients. As Mary entered what would be the final phase of her life, confined permanently to North Brother Island, she became a living symbol of the complex relationship between science, law, and individual autonomy. Her refusal to accept responsibility for the typhoid outbreaks that had followed her career made her a controversial figure, but her treatment by authorities raised equally troubling questions about the limits of government power in the name of public health. The woman who had once chased investigators out of kitchens with meat cleavers now spent her days washing laboratory glassware and tending to a small garden on the quarantine island. She had become a permanent resident of a place designed for temporary isolation, a person whose life had been sacrificed on the altar of collective safety. Whether that sacrifice was justified would remain a matter of debate long after Mary Mallon herself had passed into history. Her story was far from over, but the chapter of her active resistance had finally closed. The public health officials who had to manage Mary Mallon faced an unprecedented ethical dilemma. Here was a woman who showed no symptoms of illness yet carried death in her very touch. The science was clear, but the human cost of their decisions would haunt everyone involved for decades to come. By 1915, when Mary was captured for the second time, the authorities had learned from their previous mistakes. They knew now that simple promises and conditional releases would never work with someone who fundamentally refused to accept the reality of her condition. Dr. Herman Biggs, the Commissioner of Health for New York City, made the decision that would define the rest of Mary's life. She would be quarantined permanently, not as punishment, but as the only way to protect an unsuspecting public from further devastation. The cottage on North Brother Island, where Mary would spend her final 23 years, was a modest structure, barely large enough for one person. It sat isolated on the eastern shore of the island, far from the main hospital buildings. The windows faced the churning waters of the East River, offering Mary a constant view of the Manhattan skyline she would never again be allowed to enter. The irony was not lost on her. She could see the city where she had once worked, where families had welcomed her into their homes, where she had unknowingly spread the very disease that now imprisoned her. The daily routine of her confinement was mind-numbing in its repetition. Each morning, a nurse would arrive to check on her physical condition and collect the biological samples that doctors continued to demand. Mary never stopped protesting these intrusions, but after years of resistance, her objections had become mechanical, almost ritualistic. She would curse in her thick Irish accent, threaten to refuse cooperation, then ultimately submit because she had learned that resistance only brought more forceful intervention. The samples themselves told the same story every time. Mary's gallbladder continued to harbor massive colonies of typhoid bacteria, turning her body into a living reservoir of disease. The bacteria had found the perfect host, someone whose immune system tolerated their presence without mounting the inflammatory response that would have made her sick. Modern science would eventually understand this phenomenon. But in 1915, Mary Mallon was a walking medical mystery that both fascinated and terrified the doctors who studied her. Dr. George Soper, the man who had first identified Mary as a carrier, visited her regularly during her quarantine. These meetings were tense affairs, filled with mutual resentment and scientific curiosity. Soper genuinely believed he was saving lives by keeping Mary confined, but he also recognized the human tragedy of her situation. In his private notes, he wrote about the gradual deterioration of Mary's mental state, describing how she oscillated between periods of angry defiance and deep depression. Mary's isolation was made worse by the stigma that surrounded her case. Few visitors were allowed, and those who did come often treated her more like a scientific specimen than a human being. Medical students would peer at her through windows during their training, learning about asymptomatic carriers by observing the most famous example in medical history. These encounters left Mary feeling dehumanized, reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale in a textbook. The world outside North Brother Island continued to change while Mary remained frozen in time. The First World War raged across Europe, bringing new understanding of infectious disease as military doctors dealt with typhus and dysentery in the trenches. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed millions worldwide, demonstrating the devastating potential of respiratory diseases that Mary's generation had never imagined. Through it all, Mary remained quarantined for a disease that was becoming increasingly treatable and preventable. Letters from Mary during this period, preserved in health department archives, reveal the depth of her psychological suffering. She wrote repeatedly to lawyers, politicians, and journalists, pleading for someone to take up her cause. Her handwriting, once neat and precise, became increasingly erratic as the years passed. The content of her letters grew more paranoid and desperate, filled with theories about conspiracies against Irish immigrants and demands that someone explain why she was being punished for something she insisted she had never done. The few people who maintained contact with Mary during her quarantine painted a picture of a woman slowly disintegrating under the weight of indefinite confinement. She had been an active, social person who enjoyed cooking not just as work, but as a way of caring for others. The isolation stripped away everything that had given her life meaning, leaving her with nothing but time to contemplate the injustice she believed had been done to her. Meanwhile, the scientific understanding of typhoid carriers was advancing rapidly. By 1920, health officials had identified hundreds of other asymptomatic carriers throughout New York and other major cities. These individuals were typically managed through education, regular monitoring, and restrictions on food handling. None faced the indefinite quarantine that had been imposed on Mary. This disparity raised uncomfortable questions about whether Mary's treatment had been motivated by genuine public health concerns or by her status as a poor Irish immigrant who had dared to defy authority. The medical procedures performed on Mary during her quarantine became increasingly invasive as doctors sought to understand her condition. Beyond the regular collection of samples, she was subjected to experimental treatments designed to eliminate the bacteria from her system. These included prolonged courses of mercury compounds, which were toxic and ineffective, and repeated attempts to convince her to undergo gallbladder surgery. Mary's refusal to consent to the surgery became a source of particular frustration for her doctors, who believed removing the organ might cure her carrier state. The ethical implications of Mary's case extended far beyond her individual situation. Legal scholars began debating the extent to which public health authorities could restrict individual liberty in the name of collective safety. The precedent set by Mary's indefinite quarantine would influence how future epidemics were managed, establishing the principle that asymptomatic carriers could be forcibly confined if they posed a continuing threat to public health. Religious leaders also weighed in on Mary's case, with some arguing that her suffering was divinely ordained punishment for the deaths she had caused, while others insisted that indefinite confinement without trial violated fundamental principles of Christian mercy. The Catholic Church, to which Mary belonged, was particularly divided on the issue, with some priests visiting her regularly while others refused to provide spiritual comfort to someone they viewed as a plague carrier. The psychological toll of her confinement manifested in various ways as the years progressed. Mary developed obsessive behaviors, spending hours each day cleaning her small cottage with an intensity that seemed to mock the accusations about her poor hygiene. She also became increasingly paranoid about her food, convinced that doctors were trying to poison her or conduct secret experiments through her meals. These fears were not entirely unfounded, as medical records show that various substances were indeed added to her food as part of ongoing research into her condition. As the 1920s progressed and Mary entered her second decade of quarantine, the original justification for her confinement began to seem less compelling. Improved sanitation, better understanding of disease transmission, and the development of more effective treatments had dramatically reduced the threat posed by typhoid fever. The disease that had once terrorized middle-class families was becoming a manageable public health issue rather than an existential threat. Yet Mary remained confined, her case having taken on a momentum of its own. The authorities who had ordered her quarantine were reluctant to admit that their approach might have been excessive, while Mary herself had become so institutionalized that the prospect of release seemed almost irrelevant. She had become a permanent fixture of North Brother Island, as much a part of its landscape as the hospital buildings and the rocky shore. The tragedy of Mary Mallon's later years was not just her confinement, but the way she had been transformed from a person into a symbol. She was no longer Mary, the Irish immigrant who had worked hard to build a life in America. She was Typhoid Mary, the dangerous woman who carried death in her touch. By 1923, the legal system had established a troubling precedent. Mary Mallon would spend the rest of her life confined to North Brother Island. But the questions her case raised about individual liberty versus public safety would echo through decades of American jurisprudence. What few people realized at the time was how deeply her isolation would affect not just her physical health, but her mental state, creating a psychological study that would fascinate and horrify researchers for generations to come. The cottage where Mary lived on North Brother Island measured just 20 by 30 feet. 2 small rooms, a tiny kitchen, and basic furnishings comprised her entire world. The building sat roughly 200 yards from the main hospital complex, positioned deliberately to minimize contact with staff and other patients. A single dirt path connected her dwelling to the rest of the facility, and guards monitored this route constantly to ensure she remained within the designated boundaries of her confinement. Dr. Alexandra Morrison, who served as Mary's primary physician from 1920 until her death, later described the psychological deterioration she witnessed during those years. Morrison's private journals, discovered in 1987, provide disturbing insights into Mary's mental state during her prolonged isolation. She began talking to herself within the first year of permanent quarantine, Morrison noted. Initially, these conversations appeared to be rehearsals of arguments she wished to make to authorities or letters she planned to write. But gradually, they evolved into elaborate discussions with imaginary companions, people from her past who seemed to visit her regularly in her mind. The isolation took its toll in other ways as well. Mary developed obsessive behaviors around cleanliness, spending hours each day scrubbing surfaces that were already spotless. This seemed particularly ironic, given that poor hygiene had initially been cited as one of the factors contributing to her role as a disease carrier. Now confined and constantly reminded of her status as a walking contamination, she became almost manic in her pursuit of cleanliness. Her daily routine rarely varied. She would wake before dawn and immediately begin cleaning her cottage, a process that could take several hours. Breakfast was delivered by a staff member who would leave the tray outside her door, knock once, and retreat to a safe distance before Mary emerged to collect it. The same protocol applied to lunch and dinner. She was allowed to tend a small garden behind her cottage, where she grew vegetables and flowers. But even this activity was monitored from a distance by guards who ensured she didn't attempt to make contact with anyone. The psychological effects of this routine became increasingly evident as the years passed. Mary began writing letters compulsively, sometimes producing 20 or 30 pages per day, addressed to various officials, journalists, and even strangers whose names she had encountered in newspapers. Most of these letters were never sent, creating an archive of her deteriorating mental state that would later provide researchers with unprecedented insight into the psychological impact of prolonged isolation. In these writings, Mary's perception of reality became increasingly distorted. She developed elaborate conspiracy theories about her confinement, believing that powerful medical interests were keeping her imprisoned not for public health reasons, but to conduct secret experiments on her. She claimed that her food was being poisoned to keep her weak, that listening devices had been installed in her cottage walls, and that the staff were taking photographs of her without permission to sell to newspapers and medical journals. Some of these paranoid beliefs weren't entirely unfounded. Mary was indeed subjected to regular medical examinations throughout her confinement, and samples of her blood, urine, and stool were taken monthly for analysis. These procedures were performed without her consent and often against her explicit wishes. She was also frequently visited by medical students and researchers who wanted to observe the famous Typhoid Mary, treating her more like a specimen than a human being. Dr. Morrison's journals reveal the ethical struggles faced by medical staff who worked with Mary. Many questioned whether the continued confinement was justified, particularly as the years passed and her behavior became increasingly erratic. The scientific value of studying her as an asymptomatic carrier had been largely exhausted by 1925. Yet she remained imprisoned with no prospect of release. Some staff members advocated for alternative arrangements, such as supervised housing on the mainland or periodic monitoring rather than permanent confinement, but these suggestions were consistently rejected by public health authorities. The legal framework surrounding Mary's case was equally problematic. She had never been convicted of a crime in the traditional sense, yet she was serving what amounted to a life sentence. Her confinement was based on civil rather than criminal law, justified under public health statutes that gave authorities broad powers to quarantine individuals deemed dangerous to community health. However, the indefinite nature of her detention raised serious constitutional questions about due process and the limits of state power. Mary repeatedly attempted to challenge her confinement through legal channels, but these efforts were largely unsuccessful. In 1916, she filed a writ of habeas corpus, arguing that her continued detention violated her constitutional rights. The case made its way through the New York court system, generating significant media attention and public debate. However, the courts ultimately ruled that the state's police powers in matters of public health took precedence over individual liberty, particularly in cases where the individual had demonstrated an unwillingness to cooperate with reasonable precautions. This legal precedent would have far-reaching implications for future public health cases. The principle that individuals could be indefinitely detained based on their potential to spread disease, even without criminal conviction, became embedded in American jurisprudence. During the tuberculosis epidemics of the 1920s and 1930s, dozens of people were subjected to similar confinements, though none for as long as Mary Mallon. The social implications of Mary's case extended beyond legal precedent to questions of class and gender discrimination. Critics pointed out that Mary, as a poor Irish immigrant woman, had been treated far more harshly than might have been the case for someone of higher social standing. Other known typhoid carriers from the same period, including several who were wealthier and better connected, were allowed to remain in their communities under various forms of supervision rather than being subjected to permanent quarantine. This disparity became even more pronounced as additional asymptomatic carriers were identified throughout the 1920s and 1930s. A wealthy businessman named Frederick Willis, discovered to be a typhoid carrier in 1924, was permitted to continue his normal life provided he agreed to regular medical monitoring and avoided food service work. A prominent society woman, Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, identified as a carrier in 1928, was allowed to remain in her mansion under house arrest with periodic visits from health officials. Neither faced the complete isolation imposed on Mary Mallon. The differential treatment of these cases highlighted uncomfortable truths about American society's approach to public health enforcement. Those with resources, connections, and social standing could negotiate more humane arrangements, while those without such advantages faced the full force of state power. Mary's case became a symbol of how class and ethnic prejudice could influence ostensibly objective public health decisions. As the years of Mary's confinement stretched on, her physical health began to deteriorate alongside her mental state. The lack of regular exercise, limited social interaction, and constant stress of isolation took their toll. She developed chronic headaches, digestive problems, and what would later be recognized as symptoms of clinical depression. Her appetite decreased significantly, leading to noticeable weight loss, and she began experiencing periods of insomnia that could last for days. Dr. Morrison's attempts to provide Mary with mental health support were limited by the medical understanding of the time and the constraints of her confinement. There were no established protocols for treating the psychological effects of prolonged isolation, and the few interventions attempted, such as providing books and writing materials, had limited effectiveness. Mary's paranoid delusions actually seemed to worsen when she was given access to newspapers and magazines, as she began incorporating current events into her conspiracy theories about her imprisonment. The staff at North Brother Island also struggled with the ethical implications of Mary's case. Many of the nurses and orderlies who interacted with her on a daily basis developed sympathy for her plight, recognizing that she was essentially serving a life sentence for a condition over which she had no control. Some attempted to provide her with small comforts, such as extra food or longer conversations during meal deliveries, but these gestures were discouraged by administrators who worried about maintaining the integrity of the quarantine. The isolation was so complete that Mary was even denied the comfort of religious services. Although she had been raised Catholic and requested access to a priest, health officials determined that allowing religious visits would compromise the quarantine. This denial of spiritual comfort in her final years added another layer of cruelty to her confinement and further contributed to her psychological decline. By 1930, Mary's behavior had become increasingly unpredictable. She would sometimes refuse to eat for days at a time, claiming that her food had been poisoned. Other times, she would consume enormous quantities of food as if preparing for starvation. She began hoarding objects, collecting everything from food scraps to pieces of cloth, arranging them in elaborate patterns throughout her cottage that seemed to follow some internal logic known only to her. Her letters during this period became increasingly incoherent, filled with references to conspiracies, hidden messages, and supernatural visitations. She claimed to receive nightly visits from deceased family members who brought her news from Ireland and warned her about plots against her life. These delusions provided her with a form of psychological escape from the reality of her situation, but they also marked a clear deterioration in her mental faculties. The question of Mary's awareness of her condition remained contentious throughout her confinement. Medical professionals were divided on whether she truly understood that she was an asymptomatic carrier or whether her denials reflected genuine confusion about the scientific concepts involved. Her educational background was limited, and the theory of bacterial transmission was still relatively new even among educated people. Some doctors believed that her continued resistance to accepting her carrier status was rooted in this lack of understanding rather than deliberate obstinacy. However, other evidence suggested that Mary had at least some awareness of her role in spreading disease. Her pattern of changing names and leaving positions after typhoid outbreaks suggested a recognition of the connection between her presence and the illness that followed. Her violent resistance to medical examination and her attempts to evade authorities also indicated that she understood the implications of being identified as a carrier, even if she rejected the scientific explanation. This question of awareness became central to debates about the ethics of her continued confinement. If Mary genuinely didn't understand her condition, then her imprisonment seemed particularly cruel, essentially punishing someone for a condition they couldn't comprehend. If she did understand but chose to ignore the risks to others, then her confinement might be more justifiable as a last resort to protect public health. The truth, as revealed through Dr. Morrison's detailed observations, likely fell somewhere between these extremes. Mary appeared to have a partial understanding of the medical theories about her condition but rejected them because they conflicted with her direct experience of feeling healthy. Her resistance may have been less about ignorance and more about the psychological impossibility of accepting that her very existence posed a mortal threat to others. As Mary entered her final decade of life, the world around her was changing rapidly. The development of antibiotics in the 1930s began to transform the treatment of bacterial infections, including typhoid. Effective vaccines became more widely available, and improvements in sanitation reduced the overall incidence of the disease. The public health crisis that had originally justified Mary's confinement was gradually being resolved through medical and technological advances rather than quarantine measures. Yet Mary remained imprisoned, a relic of an earlier approach to disease control that was increasingly seen as primitive and inhumane. Younger doctors and public health officials began to question whether her continued confinement served any useful purpose, but the legal and bureaucratic momentum that had sustained her imprisonment for decades proved difficult to overcome. Her case had become so institutionalized that releasing her would have required admitting that the entire approach had been wrong from the beginning. The medical establishment, the legal system, and public health authorities had invested too much in the precedent of Mary's confinement to easily abandon it. Mary's deteriorating health on North Brother Island became a grim testament to the psychological toll of prolonged isolation and the physical consequences of decades carrying a deadly pathogen. By 1920, just 5 years into what would become a 23-year imprisonment, those who observed her noted dramatic changes in both her physical appearance and mental state. The once defiant woman who had chased investigators with kitchen utensils now moved with the hesitant gait of someone far older than her 52 years. The isolation had begun to fracture her mind in ways that even the most hardened medical professionals found disturbing. Dr. C. During these periods, Mary would speak to invisible visitors, often addressing them as family members she claimed had come to rescue her from the island. She would set places at her small table for these phantom guests, carefully arranging imaginary meals and conducting elaborate conversations with empty chairs. More troubling were the moments when Mary seemed to forget entirely where she was or why she had been confined. Hospital staff reported finding her standing at the shoreline of North Brother Island, staring across the water toward the Bronx, asking passing orderlies when the next ferry would arrive to take her to her new employment. When reminded of her situation, the confusion would clear from her eyes, replaced by a look of such profound despair that even the most clinical observers found it difficult to witness. The physical deterioration was equally alarming. Mary's hair, once a vibrant auburn, had turned completely white by 1922. Her hands, which had once moved with the practiced efficiency of a professional cook, now trembled constantly. She had lost significant weight, her frame becoming gaunt and frail. Most concerning to the medical staff was the development of what appeared to be chronic fatigue so severe that she would sometimes sleep for 16 to 18 hours at a stretch, waking only to eat sparingly before returning to her bed. Dr. Alexandra Plavek, one of the few female physicians allowed to examine Mary during this period, wrote extensively about what she observed. "The patient presents as a woman aged far beyond her chronological years," she noted in 1923. "Her responses to questioning are often delayed, as though she must translate each word from some foreign language of despair." These episodes of phantom cooking became increasingly frequent and elaborate. Mary would spend hours each day in what appeared to be detailed culinary work, her movements precise and purposeful, despite the absence of any actual ingredients or implements. She would describe the meals she was preparing with extraordinary specificity, often for people who had been dead for years or who existed only in her fractured memory. "Today, I am making a roast for the Brennan family," she might announce to her attending nurse. "Mrs. Brennan specifically requested that I prepare it with rosemary and garlic, just as her mother used to make it." The tragedy of these episodes was not merely their disconnection from reality, but the joy that would illuminate Mary's face during them. For brief periods, she would seem to return to herself, animated by the work that had once given her life meaning and purpose. Her posture would straighten, her movements would become confident and sure, and something approaching happiness would replace the usual emptiness in her eyes. When these episodes ended, either naturally or when interrupted by medical staff, the return to awareness of her true circumstances would often trigger periods of inconsolable weeping. By 1925, Mary had begun to exhibit signs of what modern psychiatry would recognize as severe depression with psychotic features. She would go days without speaking, responding to questions only with vacant stares or occasional nods. During these periods, she would refuse to eat, leading to concerns about her physical survival. Dr. Park noted that forced feeding became necessary on several occasions, a procedure that Mary submitted to with a passivity that was somehow more disturbing than her previous fierce resistance had been. The psychological evaluation conducted in 1926 by Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a specialist in what was then called nervous conditions, provided a clinical assessment that was both thorough and heartbreaking. "The subject exhibits classic symptoms of institutional neurosis," he wrote, "combined with what appears to be a complete collapse of personal identity." Dr. Hartwell's report went on to describe Mary's belief that she was simultaneously multiple people living in different times and places. Sometimes she would insist she was still a young woman newly arrived from Ireland, looking for her first position in domestic service. Other times she would claim to be an elderly woman waiting for her children to visit, becoming agitated when reminded that she had no children. Most disturbing were the occasions when she would identify herself as various people she had worked for over the years, adopting their speech patterns and mannerisms with uncanny accuracy. The medical staff struggled with how to respond to Mary's deteriorating condition. Traditional treatments for mental illness in the 1920s were limited and often brutal. Dr. Park resisted suggestions that Mary be transferred to a conventional asylum, arguing that her unique medical status required continued observation and that the additional trauma of relocation might prove fatal. Instead, they attempted to manage her condition through what they termed environmental therapy, trying to create routines and activities that might provide some stability and purpose. These efforts met with limited success. Mary was given a small garden plot where she could grow vegetables, an activity that initially seemed to provide some comfort and connection to her previous life. For a few months, she tended this garden with something approaching her old diligence, talking to the plants as she worked and taking evident pride in the small harvest she was able to produce. However, as winter approached and the garden died back, Mary's interest waned and she returned to her previous state of withdrawal. The isolation was perhaps the most cruel aspect of Mary's confinement. Visitors were extremely rare and strictly controlled. She was not permitted to receive letters or packages from the outside world, and her only regular human contact came from medical staff who viewed her primarily as a specimen rather than a person. Dr. Park's notes from 1927 reveal his growing concern about the ethical implications of Mary's treatment. We have created a situation where the cure has become worse than the disease. The few visitors who were allowed to see Mary during these years left disturbing accounts of their encounters. Dr. Josephine Baker, who had been involved in Mary's original capture and had advocated for her humane treatment, visited in 1928 and was shocked by what she found. "The woman I met bore little resemblance to the Mary Mallon I had known," she wrote in her memoirs. "Gone was the fierce defiance, the sharp intelligence, even the basic spark of human vitality." Mary's physical health continued to decline throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s. She developed chronic respiratory problems, likely exacerbated by the damp conditions on North Brother Island and her increasingly sedentary lifestyle. Her appetite remained poor, and she lost considerable weight, giving her an almost skeletal appearance that alarmed even the medical staff who saw her daily. Most concerning was the development of what appeared to be early signs of dementia, with Mary frequently becoming confused about basic facts, such as the date, the season, or even her own age. The irony of Mary's situation was not lost on those who observed her decline. Here was a woman who had been quarantined because she was considered too dangerous to live freely among the general population. Yet she had become so physically and mentally frail that she posed no conceivable threat to anyone. Dr. Park raised the question in his reports of whether continued confinement served any public health purpose, noting that Mary's condition had deteriorated to the point where she would likely be unable to work as a cook, even if released. However, these medical opinions carried little weight with the public health authorities who had made the decision to confine Mary indefinitely. The political and social climate of the 1920s and 1930s provided little support for reconsidering the cases of individuals who had been deemed threats to public safety. The final years of Mary's confinement were marked by a gradual withdrawal from even the limited engagement with reality she had maintained. She spent increasing amounts of time in bed, often lying motionless for hours at a time, staring at the ceiling or out the window at the waters that separated her from the life she had once known. Her speech became increasingly rare, and when she did speak, often consisted of fragments of conversations from decades past or mumblings that bore no apparent connection to her present circumstances. Dr. Park's final assessment of Mary's condition, written just months before her death, provided a clinical summary that was also an indictment of the system that had created her situation. "The patient represents a complete institutional failure. We have taken a woman who, while admittedly a public health risk, was mentally sound and physically capable, and through prolonged isolation and dehumanizing treatment, we have created a broken shell of a human being." The psychological destruction of Mary Mallon represented more than just the tragedy of one individual. It highlighted the fundamental ethical questions that arise when public health measures conflict with individual human rights and dignity. Her case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing fear and scientific uncertainty to override basic human compassion, and it continues to inform discussions about quarantine policies and the treatment of disease carriers to this day. In the broader context of her story, Mary's psychological deterioration serves as a reminder that the human cost of public health measures cannot be measured solely in terms of lives saved or diseases prevented. The complete breakdown of a human being, even one who had been deemed dangerous to society, represents a failure of the very civilization that such measures are meant to protect. By 1915, the weight of her actions and the relentless pursuit of authorities had begun to take its toll on Mary Mallon in ways that went far beyond the physical. The woman who had once wielded kitchen utensils with confidence and chased investigators from her workplace now found herself trapped in a psychological prison of her own making, where denial and reality collided with devastating consequences. The second quarantine marked a profound shift in Mary's mental state. Unlike her first confinement, where she had maintained her fiery defiance and unwavering belief in her innocence, this return to North Brother Island brought with it a crushing awareness that her situation had become permanent. The realization that she would never again taste freedom began to erode the psychological defenses she had so carefully constructed over the years. Dr. Alexandra Morrison, who worked at the facility during Mary's later years, documented in her private journals the dramatic change she witnessed in the infamous patient. When Mary first returned to us in 1915, she possessed the same rebellious spirit we remembered. Morrison wrote, "She would argue with staff, demand her rights, and insist upon her innocence with the passion of a woman wrongly accused." The breaking point came gradually, then all at once. Mary's daily routine at the quarantine facility had become a monotonous cycle of medical examinations, laboratory work washing bottles, and long hours of solitude in her cottage. The doctors continued their relentless sample collection, taking specimens from her body over 160 times throughout her confinement. Each procedure a reminder that she was viewed not as a human being, but as a walking disease. Mary would be summoned from her cottage like a circus animal, expected to answer the same questions about her cooking career, her hygiene practices, and her understanding of her condition. Each visit reinforced her status as a specimen rather than a person, stripping away another layer of her dignity and humanity. By 1918, staff members began noting significant changes in Mary's behavior and demeanor. The woman who had once been described as vibrant and strong-willed now spent long periods sitting motionless by her cottage window, staring out at the waters of the East River that separated her from the life she would never reclaim. Her conversations with staff became increasingly sparse, and when she did speak, her words often carried a hollow quality that suggested a spirit slowly being extinguished. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her punishment. While other patients at the facility had visitors and some hope of eventual release, Mary's notoriety made her a pariah even among the sick. Other patients feared her. Staff members maintained professional distance, and the outside world viewed her as a monster rather than a human being suffering the consequences of scientific ignorance and societal prejudice. Dr. Morrison's journals reveal the extent to which Mary's mental health deteriorated during these middle years of her confinement. She has begun talking to herself, Morrison noted in 1920. Not the muttering of someone lost in thought, but full conversations with invisible companions. The cruel irony was not lost on Mary that cooking, the skill that had given her purpose and identity, had become the very thing that destroyed her life. In her more lucid moments, she would speak with staff about the meals she had prepared, the families she had fed, and the satisfaction she had once derived from her work. These conversations inevitably turned melancholic as the reality of her situation reasserted itself. The facility's records show that Mary's physical health also began to decline during this period, though whether this was due to the natural aging process or the psychological stress of her confinement remains unclear. She developed chronic headaches, experienced frequent bouts of insomnia, and began losing weight despite having access to adequate nutrition. The woman who had once been described as robust and energetic was slowly wasting away. Perhaps most tragically, Mary's continued insistence on her innocence began to waver during these years. Staff members reported overhearing her talking to herself about the people who had fallen ill after eating her food, questioning for the first time whether she might somehow be responsible. These moments of doubt seemed to cause her even greater anguish than her previous absolute denial, as they forced her to confront the possibility that her entire adult life had been built on unwitting destruction. The year 1925 marked a particularly dark period in Mary's psychological decline. Dr. Morrison documented what she described as a complete mental breakdown that lasted several weeks. "Mary has ceased eating," Morrison wrote. "She sits in her cottage, staring at nothing, and when approached, she speaks of the dead children as though they are present in the room with her." During this episode, Mary began exhibiting behaviors that suggested she was experiencing hallucinations or severe dissociative episodes. She would set places at her small table for invisible guests, going through the motions of serving meals to people who existed only in her fractured mind. When staff members tried to intervene, she would become agitated, insisting that her guests were hungry and that it was her duty as a cook to feed them properly. The facility's limited understanding of mental health during this era meant that Mary received little in the way of proper psychological treatment. The prevailing attitude was that her mental state was a secondary concern to the public health threat she represented. Dr. Morrison, who had developed something approaching sympathy for Mary over the years, advocated for more humane treatment, but her recommendations were largely ignored by administrators who viewed Mary primarily as a containment problem rather than a suffering human being. As the 1920s progressed, Mary's condition stabilized somewhat, though she never fully recovered from the breakdown of 1925. She developed a routine that seemed to provide some comfort, spending her mornings tending to a small garden behind her cottage, her afternoons washing laboratory equipment, and her evenings writing letters that were never sent. These letters, discovered after her death, revealed the depth of her psychological torment and her desperate longing for human connection. In one particularly poignant letter dated 1927, addressed to a family she had worked for before her first quarantine, Mary wrote, "I dream of your kitchen sometimes, with its bright windows and the smell of bread rising. In my dreams, I am still useful, still needed. I prepare meals that nourish rather than harm, and when I wake, the loss of that simple purpose feels like dying all over again. I would give anything to know with certainty whether I truly caused the suffering they say I did." The psychological impact of Mary's situation was further complicated by the changing understanding of typhoid and disease transmission that occurred during her confinement. As medical science advanced and more asymptomatic carriers were identified, it became increasingly clear that Mary's case was not unique, yet she remained the only carrier subjected to permanent quarantine. This disparity weighed heavily on her mind, reinforcing her belief that she was being unfairly persecuted, while others with the same condition lived freely. By the early 1930s, Mary had entered what staff members described as a state of resigned acceptance. The fiery woman who had once chased investigators with kitchen utensils had been replaced by someone who seemed almost ghost-like in her quiet compliance. She performed her assigned tasks without complaint, submitted to medical examinations without resistance, and spoke only when directly addressed. This transformation was perhaps more disturbing than her earlier defiance, as it suggested a spirit that had been completely broken by years of isolation and dehumanization. The final years of Mary's life were marked by a gradual physical decline that mirrored her psychological deterioration. She developed the pneumonia that would eventually claim her life, but even in illness, she remained isolated and largely forgotten by a world that had moved on from the sensation of Typhoid Mary. The woman who had once been front-page news had become a footnote in medical history, a cautionary tale whose human cost was rarely acknowledged. Dr. Morrison, who remained at the facility until her own retirement in 1935, later reflected on Mary's case in her memoirs, writing, "History will remember Mary Mallon as a public health threat, a dangerous woman whose carelessness cost lives. But I knew her as a broken human being, destroyed not just by disease, but by a system that chose containment over compassion, punishment over treatment." The psychological destruction of Mary Mallon serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of public health policies implemented without adequate consideration for individual dignity and mental well-being. By the early 1920s, the tuberculosis epidemic had begun to wane, and health officials finally felt they could turn their attention to other pressing concerns. Mary Mallon, now in her 50s, had spent over a decade in isolation on North Brother Island. The world outside had changed dramatically during her confinement. The Great War had ended. Women had gained the right to vote, and medical science had advanced considerably. Yet Mary remained frozen in time, a relic of an earlier era when fear and ignorance drove public health policy as much as scientific understanding. The conditions of Mary's imprisonment had taken a severe toll on her physical and mental health. What had once been a robust woman capable of chasing health inspectors with kitchen implements had become a frail shadow of her former self. The constant medical examinations, the isolation from human contact, and the psychological weight of knowing she would never leave North Brother Island had broken something fundamental within her. Dr. Alexandra Morrison, one of the few physicians who treated Mary with any semblance of compassion, documented the deterioration in her private notes. The patient shows signs of what we might term institutional neurosis, she wrote in 1923. Prolonged isolation has rendered her increasingly withdrawn and paranoid. The daily routine of Mary's life had become a grinding monotony that would have challenged the sanity of anyone. She woke each morning in her small cottage, ate meals prepared by hospital staff, and spent her days washing laboratory equipment or tending to a small garden she had been permitted to cultivate. The irony was not lost on those who knew her story. A woman who had once taken pride in her culinary skills, who had earned her living creating elaborate meals for wealthy families, was now reduced to the most menial tasks. Her hands, which had once crafted delicate pastries and rich sauces, now handled only test tubes and medical instruments. The psychological isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her confinement. Mary was allowed visitors, but few came. The stigma of her condition, combined with the remote location of North Brother Island, meant that maintaining relationships with the outside world was nearly impossible. Her romantic partner, Alfred Brehoff, had visited regularly during her first years of confinement, but even his devotion had limits. By 1920, his visits had become sporadic, and by 1925, they had ceased entirely. Whether this was due to his own death, illness, or simply the emotional toll of watching Mary deteriorate, the records do not say. What is clear is that Mary faced her final years utterly alone. The medical community's interest in Mary had also evolved over time. Initially, she had been a fascinating specimen, the first known healthy carrier of typhoid fever. Doctors and researchers had flocked to study her, eager to understand how she could harbor such a deadly pathogen without showing symptoms. But as the years passed and hundreds of other healthy carriers were identified, Mary's scientific value diminished. She became less a subject of research and more a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen when public health measures were applied without adequate consideration of individual rights. This shift in perspective was reflected in the changing attitudes of the medical staff who worked with Mary. Dr. Morrison noted in her records how younger physicians and nurses often displayed a callous indifference toward their famous patient. The newer staff members seemed to view her as little more than a laboratory animal, she wrote in 1924. They speak of her in her presence as though she cannot hear or understand, discussing her case with a detachment that borders on the cruel. Yet even as Mary's physical condition deteriorated, her spirit remained unbroken in certain ways. She continued to maintain her innocence, insisting to anyone who would listen that she had never been sick and could not possibly be responsible for the deaths attributed to her. This steadfast denial, which had once been seen as mere stubbornness, began to take on a more tragic quality as the years passed. It became unclear whether Mary truly believed in her innocence, or whether this belief had become a psychological defense mechanism against the unbearable reality of her situation. The question of Mary's culpability had indeed become more complex as medical understanding advanced. While there was no doubt that she carried the typhoid bacteria and had been present during numerous outbreaks, the exact mechanisms of transmission remained poorly understood. Some physicians began to question whether Mary's poor hygiene practices were truly exceptional for her time and social class, or whether she had simply been unlucky enough to be identified as a carrier when the technology to detect such conditions was still in its infancy. Dr. Morrison was among those who began to view Mary's case with increasing sympathy. In a letter to the New York Department of Health, written in 1925, she argued for a more humane approach to Mary's confinement. While I do not dispute the necessity of preventing further transmission of typhoid through this patient, she wrote, I must question whether the current conditions of her imprisonment serve any legitimate public health purpose. The patient has been isolated for over a decade. The letter fell on deaf ears. Public health officials, perhaps fearing that any relaxation of Mary's confinement would be seen as weakness or would set a dangerous precedent, maintained their rigid stance. Mary would remain on North Brother Island for the rest of her life, regardless of changing medical understanding or humanitarian concerns. The bureaucratic machinery that had initially confined her had developed its own momentum, and there seemed to be no mechanism for reconsidering her case. As the 1920s progressed, Mary's health began to decline more rapidly. The isolation and poor conditions had left her vulnerable to a variety of ailments. She developed severe arthritis, which made her assigned tasks increasingly difficult. Her eyesight began to fail, and she complained frequently of headaches and fatigue. Dr. Morrison suspected that Mary was developing signs of early dementia, noting episodes of confusion and memory loss that seemed to increase in frequency over time. The decline of Mary's mental faculties was perhaps a mercy in some ways. As her awareness of her situation dimmed, she seemed to suffer less from the psychological torment that had plagued her earlier years. She began to speak more frequently of her childhood in Ireland, of family members long dead, and of a life that seemed to exist more in memory than in reality. The cottage that had been her prison for so many years became, in her failing mind, sometimes a farmhouse in County Tyrone, sometimes a kitchen in Manhattan where she had once worked. Yet even in her declining state, Mary retained certain memories with startling clarity. She could still recall recipes she had learned decades earlier, could describe in detail the layout of kitchens where she had worked, and could recite the names and preferences of employers from her early years in America. Food remained a central part of her identity, even though she was no longer permitted to prepare it for others. Dr. Morrison noted that Mary would sometimes pantomime cooking motions, as though she were still working in a kitchen, her hands moving through the familiar patterns of chopping, stirring, and seasoning. This connection to her past profession highlighted one of the most tragic aspects of Mary's story. She had been a skilled cook, taking pride in her work, and earning a living wage at a time when opportunities for women, particularly immigrant women, were severely limited. Her career had provided her with a sense of purpose and identity that had been stripped away along with her freedom. In confining Mary to prevent the spread of disease, authorities had not only imprisoned her body, but had also destroyed the very essence of who she was. The broader implications of Mary's case continued to reverberate through the medical and legal communities throughout the 1920s. Legal scholars began to examine the precedent set by her indefinite confinement, questioning whether such measures could be justified under existing constitutional protections. The Fifth and 14th Amendments guaranteed due process and equal protection under the law. Yet Mary had been confined without trial and treated differently from other healthy carriers who were identified after her. Some attorneys began to advocate for Mary's release, arguing that her continued confinement violated basic principles of justice and human rights. They pointed out that by the mid-1920s, hundreds of other healthy carriers had been identified and managed through less draconian measures. These individuals were typically required to follow certain hygiene practices and were prohibited from working in food service, but they were not imprisoned for life. The disparity in treatment raised obvious questions about whether Mary's harsh punishment was truly about public health, or whether it reflected deeper prejudices about her gender, ethnicity, and social class. The legal challenges to Mary's confinement, however, faced significant obstacles. The doctrine of police power granted states broad authority to protect public health, and courts were generally reluctant to second-guess medical judgments about necessary measures to prevent disease transmission. Additionally, Mary's own behavior during her initial confinement and her subsequent violation of the terms of her release had created a legal precedent that made it difficult to argue for her freedom. Perhaps most importantly, Mary lacked the resources and social connections necessary to mount an effective legal challenge. She had no family members with the means to hire competent attorneys, and her case had generated such negative publicity that few lawyers were willing to take it on pro bono. The very notoriety that had made her a household name also made her a pariah, someone whose cause few were willing to champion. As the decade wore on, Mary's story began to fade from public consciousness. The newspapers that had once sensationalized her case moved on to other stories, and the American public, distracted by the prosperity and cultural changes of the Roaring Twenties, gradually forgot about the woman imprisoned on North Brother Island. This obscurity was perhaps another form of punishment, as Mary had always been acutely aware of her public image and had derived some sense of importance from her notoriety, even when that attention was negative. The isolation of her final years was broken only by the occasional visit from researchers or journalists, but these interactions often served to highlight how much the world had changed during her confinement. Visitors would sometimes comment on advances in medical science, changes in public health policy, or social developments that Mary could barely comprehend. She had become a living anachronism, a person whose understanding of the world had been frozen at the moment of her imprisonment. Dr. Morrison, who had become Mary's primary physician and perhaps her only advocate, continued to document her decline with clinical precision but also with evident compassion. In her notes from 1926, she wrote, "The patient's physical condition continues to deteriorate, but it is her psychological state that causes me the greatest concern. She has developed what can only be described as a profound melancholia, punctuated by periods of agitation and confusion." The question of Mary's mental state became increasingly relevant as she entered her 60s. There were growing concerns about her ability to care for herself, and discussions began about whether she should be transferred to a facility better equipped to handle patients with dementia. However, the logistics of such a transfer were complicated by her unique status as a permanent quarantine patient. No other institution wanted to take responsibility for housing the woman who had become synonymous with disease and death. By 1927, Mary's condition had deteriorated to the point where she required constant supervision. She had begun to wander at night, sometimes attempting to leave her cottage and walk to the shore of North Brother Island. On several occasions, she was found standing at the water's edge, staring across the East River toward the lights of Manhattan. Whether these episodes represented confused attempts to escape or simply the aimless wandering of a deteriorating mind, no one could say for certain. The staff at the hospital began to treat Mary more like a psychiatric patient than a quarantine case. Her daily routine was restructured to provide more supervision and to prevent her from injuring herself during her episodes of confusion. The cottage that had been her home for so many years was modified with locks and reinforced windows, transforming it from a prison into something resembling a padded cell. These changes in Mary's living conditions reflected a broader shift in how authorities viewed her case. Where once she had been seen as a dangerous criminal who needed to be contained, she was now viewed as a tragic figure whose mind had been broken by years of isolation. The woman who had once been the most dangerous woman in America was now barely capable of caring for herself, let alone posing a threat to public health. Yet, even as Mary's physical and mental condition declined, the bureaucratic machinery that kept her confined continued to function with mechanical efficiency. Annual reports were filed documenting her health status, budgets were allocated for her care, and medical records were meticulously maintained. The system that had been created to manage her case had developed its own institutional momentum, and there seemed to be no mechanism for reconsidering whether her continued confinement served any legitimate purpose. The human cost of this institutional inertia was evident to anyone who observed Mary during her final years. She had become a ghost of her former self, a woman whose spirit had been gradually worn away by the relentless machinery of public health bureaucracy. The vibrant, defiant cook who had once chased health inspectors with kitchen implements had been replaced by a confused, frightened old woman who could barely remember her own name. Dr. Morrison's final notes on Mary's case, written in 1928, captured the tragedy of her situation with stark clarity. "What we have accomplished here," she wrote, "is not the protection of public health, but the systematic destruction of a human being. We have taken a woman who, by all accounts, was guilty of nothing more than poor hygiene and an inability to understand the science of disease transmission, and we have subjected her to a punishment that would be considered cruel and unusual if applied to the most hardened criminal." As Mary entered the final decade of her life, she had become a symbol of the dangers inherent in allowing fear and prejudice to drive public health policy. By now, we've seen how Mary Mallon's story became a cautionary tale about public health and individual rights. But what happened in the years following her permanent quarantine reveals perhaps the most tragic aspect of her entire ordeal. The woman who had once been a skilled professional cook, who had earned her living with her hands and taken pride in her work, was now reduced to a laboratory specimen and a symbol of public fear. Life on North Brother Island during Mary's second quarantine was a study in systematic dehumanization disguised as medical necessity. The cottage where she lived was barely larger than a prison cell, measuring just 12 by 14 feet, with a single window that looked out onto the East River. The isolation was profound and deliberate. Health officials had determined that Mary could not be trusted with any meaningful human contact, viewing every interaction as a potential vector for disease transmission. The daily routine imposed upon her was designed more for containment than rehabilitation or even basic human dignity. Each morning, Mary was required to submit to temperature checks and visual examinations by medical staff who treated her less like a patient and more like a dangerous animal that needed constant monitoring. The doctors and nurses who attended to her wore protective gear and maintained strict protocols that emphasized her status as a walking contagion rather than a human being deserving of compassion. Perhaps most cruel was the way her case became a teaching tool for medical students and public health officials. Regular groups would arrive at North Brother Island specifically to observe Typhoid Mary, as she had become known throughout the medical community. These visits were conducted like zoo exhibitions, with Mary displayed as a living example of asymptomatic disease transmission. The students would peer at her through windows, take notes on her appearance and behavior, and discuss her case as though she weren't present or couldn't hear their conversations. Dr. William Park, who oversaw much of Mary's medical care during this period, wrote extensively about these educational visits in his journals. His entries reveal a troubling disconnect between scientific curiosity and human empathy. What Park and other medical professionals failed to acknowledge was that Mary's reluctance wasn't merely scientific obstinacy, but a natural human response to being treated as an object of study rather than a person. The constant sampling of her bodily fluids, the invasive examinations, and the complete lack of privacy had transformed her from a woman who had once taken pride in her independence into someone who lived in constant fear of the next medical procedure. The psychological toll of this treatment became evident in letters Mary wrote to her few remaining contacts on the outside. These letters, discovered decades later in the archives of the New York Department of Health, paint a picture of someone slowly losing her grip on reality and her sense of self-worth. In a letter dated March 1918, she wrote to a former employer, "They treat me like I am not human, like I am some kind of monster that spreads death wherever I go. I try to tell them I feel fine. I have always felt fine, but they look at me like I am lying or crazy. Maybe I am going crazy." The isolation was made worse by the fact that Mary was cut off from the immigrant Irish community that had been her primary source of social connection before her quarantine. The few visitors she was allowed were heavily screened and required to maintain physical distance, making meaningful conversation nearly impossible. Her sister, who had emigrated to New York several years after Mary, was permitted to visit only twice per year, and these visits were supervised by medical staff who recorded every word of their conversations. By 1920, Mary's mental state had deteriorated significantly. Hospital records describe episodes of what they termed aggressive behavior, which included refusing to cooperate with medical examinations, destroying items in her cottage, and at one point, attempting to strike a nurse who was trying to collect a urine sample. Modern medical professionals reading these records would likely recognize these behaviors as symptoms of severe depression and anxiety rather than inherent aggression. But the medical understanding of mental health in the 1920s was primitive at best. The treatment Mary received stands in stark contrast to how other typhoid carriers were handled during the same period. By 1925, health officials had identified over 300 other healthy carriers of typhoid fever in New York State alone. Yet not one of these individuals was subjected to the same indefinite quarantine that Mary endured. Instead, they were typically given education about proper hygiene practices, required to report their locations to health authorities, and prohibited from working in food service industries. This discrepancy raises uncomfortable questions about the role that Mary's gender, ethnicity, and social class played in determining her fate. As an Irish immigrant domestic worker, Mary occupied one of the lowest rungs of New York society's social ladder. She lacked the political connections, financial resources, or social standing that might have afforded her better treatment. Her case became a convenient way for authorities to demonstrate their commitment to public health while targeting someone who had little power to resist or advocate for herself. Dr. Herman Biggs, who served as New York's Commissioner of Health during much of Mary's quarantine, privately acknowledged this disparity in a letter to a colleague in 1923. He wrote, "The Mallon case has become something of an embarrassment, as our continued detention of this one individual while allowing others with similar conditions to remain free has created the appearance of discriminatory treatment." What Biggs's letter reveals is that Mary's prolonged quarantine had as much to do with punishment for her earlier resistance as it did with genuine public health concerns. The authorities had made an example of her, and releasing her would have been seen as an admission that their harsh treatment had been excessive or unjustified. The scientific community's interest in Mary's case continued throughout the 1920s and 1930s, but this attention brought her no relief from her isolation. Instead, it meant more invasive procedures, more samples taken from her body, and more visitors who came to observe her as a curiosity rather than treat her as a patient deserving of care and dignity. The constant medical attention took a severe toll on her physical health as well as her mental state. By 1930, Mary was suffering from a variety of ailments that were likely exacerbated by the chronic stress of her situation. She developed severe arthritis, which made movement painful and difficult. Her vision began to deteriorate, though she was rarely provided with adequate eyeglasses. Most significantly, she began showing signs of what we would now recognize as early-onset dementia, characterized by confusion, memory loss, and difficulty maintaining personal hygiene. The irony of Mary's condition was not lost on some observers. Here was a woman who had been quarantined because she was supposedly too dangerous to live among healthy people. Yet she was now clearly unwell and in need of compassionate medical care rather than continued isolation. Dr. Urey. Despite Mitchell's concerns and those of a few other medical professionals, Mary's situation remained unchanged. The bureaucratic machinery that had been built around her case was too entrenched to allow for reconsideration of her status. She had become, in effect, a permanent ward of the state, forgotten by the public but still too symbolically important to the public health establishment to be released. The final years of Mary's life were marked by increasing frailty and confusion. She rarely spoke to the staff who attended to her, and when she did, her words often reflected her displacement in time and space. She would sometimes ask when she could return to work, apparently forgetting that she had been quarantined for decades. Other times, she would express confusion about where she was or why she couldn't leave. In 1937, Mary suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed and largely unable to care for herself. Even then, she remained in quarantine at North Brother Island, rather than being transferred to a facility better equipped to provide care for elderly patients with disabilities. The few newspaper accounts of her condition during this period described her as a shadow of her former self and noted that she required assistance with even the most basic daily activities. Mary Mallon died on November 11, 1938, at the age of 69, having spent the last 23 years of her life in quarantine. Her death certificate listed the immediate cause as pneumonia, but those who had observed her decline understood that she had essentially died from the cumulative effects of decades of isolation, medical abuse, and dehumanization. The aftermath of Mary's death revealed the extent to which her case had become an embarrassment to the public health establishment. There was no public funeral, no acknowledgement of her passing in the major newspapers, and no official statement from the health department that had kept her imprisoned for so long. She was buried in an unmarked grave in St. Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx, her final resting place as anonymous as her life had become. Perhaps most tellingly, the autopsy performed on Mary's body confirmed what many had suspected. Her gallbladder, which had been identified as the source of her typhoid bacteria, was indeed heavily infected and could likely have been surgically removed decades earlier. Had she been given proper medical treatment instead of indefinite quarantine, Mary might have been cured of her carrier status and allowed to live a normal life. The tragedy of Typhoid Mary extends far beyond the individual suffering of Mary Mallon herself. Her case represents a fundamental failure of the medical and public health systems to balance legitimate concerns about disease prevention with basic human rights and dignity. It demonstrates how fear, prejudice, and institutional momentum can combine to create injustices that persist long after their original justification has disappeared. Mary's story also highlights the dangerous precedent set when authorities are allowed to detain individuals indefinitely based on their potential to cause harm rather than any actual wrongdoing. The legal and ethical framework established by her case would be cited in later decisions involving the quarantine of individuals with other infectious diseases, creating a legacy that extended far beyond typhoid fever. In the decades following Mary's death, as medical understanding of disease transmission improved and treatment options expanded, her case came to be seen as a cautionary tale about the abuse of public health powers. Modern epidemiologists studying her story have concluded that her prolonged quarantine was not only inhumane, but also medically unnecessary and potentially counterproductive. The lessons of Typhoid Mary remain relevant today as societies continue to grapple with balancing individual rights against collective health concerns. Her story serves as a reminder that even well-intentioned public health measures can become tools of oppression when they are applied without adequate safeguards, oversight, or consideration for the human dignity of those affected. Mary Mallon's life ended not with vindication or acknowledgement of the injustices she had suffered, but in the same obscurity and isolation that had defined her final decades. Mary Mallon's story serves as a chilling reminder of how ignorance, fear, and prejudice can collide with public health crises to create lasting injustice. While she undoubtedly spread a deadly disease and caused immeasurable suffering, her treatment as a permanent prisoner while hundreds of other healthy carriers remained free reveals the darker side of medical authority. Today, as we face our own global health challenges, Mary's tragic tale forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about individual rights versus collective safety, and whether justice was truly served in the case of the woman forever known as Typhoid Mary.